Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Law. I'm still sick as a parrot, as they say, but I will soldier on. Simon, how are you doing this week?
Good morning. I'm not too bad. You're feeling unwell. I was just listening to Talk TV earlier, and Julia Hartley-Brewer was on there talking about assisted dying. And she was saying, I think people who have an unbearable existence should be allowed to choose to die. Maybe you're feeling like that. I know who I'd choose to die, but that's
well, I mean, I don't feel it that bad that I choose to die, but
yeah.
As Morrissey said, I'm still ill. Now this week we have a very special guest with us.
Can I just say there's a backstory to that, isn't there, AA? Because I said to AA the other day, I was down at the lodge. I was presenting him with his portable humidor on a velvet cushion, so he could select another of his 300-pound cigars. I was like some sort of pathetic Francis Foster character to his masterly Constantine Kissin, and he sort of sat there in sort of Magian splendor, listening to his favorite rap singers, the rap singers. And I said, AA, we've been going through this classic period of Adam Curtis where, he's just starting to find his voice with his trademark larky style of eclectic soundtrack and his quietly authoritative narration, his intercutting of quirky archive film of old movies, American pom-pom girls and endless corridors. But now, AA, it's dangerous. We're heading into a much, much darker phase of his work. He's gazing into the abyss of modernity with its suffocating propaganda, its politically driven psychological manipulation, its alienation, and the bleak, machinic anomie of life in a crumbling, deracinated European civilization on the brink of its own suicide. And I said, I'm scared. I said, I don't think I can get away with dropping in a few references to Mark Fisher and 70s pop culture anymore. I said, we're going to need someone capable of handling Curtis's industrial strength black pills. And AA, he just put his feet back up on the desk and he smiled with the cool assurance of a Vince McMahon at the height of his powers. He took a measured puff of his Yamasa Davidoff and he said, Simon, don't worry, son. I've heard you. Leave this to me. I've got just the man.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's nice to be aboard. I mean, I do think the subject matter is like of these Curtis documentaries. I've been listening to your other shows on when I've been walking the dog and whatnot, and I do think what's in this one is like the complete antithesis of my sort of worldview, if you like. It's funny enough. I had my own little bit of opening patter, and I've been mixed up with the animal sort of health service this week because my dog had an operation, and she's been a bit stressed and everything. And then yesterday I was sitting there and just out of the blue, the girl from the vets rang me up and just asked how my dog was getting on, and I said, well, she's a bit anxious, she's a bit panicky. And this was just out of the blue. And then when I actually went to the surgery, it's the second time I've noticed this year, where all of the staff are these like very nice, very pretty kind of 30-year-old women who are also kind of intelligent. And then the surgeons are these kind of Nigel Havers chads. And the service itself is just immaculate. And I've come to this kind of take where if you, the medical attention that a dog gets is better than what we get. Like this is objectively better than the NHS on every metric. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the care. I couldn't believe how nice everybody was, how clean everything was. Like I said it in to AA and yesterday, like I might actually have a word and say, look, can I just come here instead of the NHS? Like, can I just wait in line after a horse and a cat to be treated? Because just if the outcome that I want is good medical attention with intelligent people who are going to take care of us, like it seems, like to measure me hard, or if I find a little lump in my chest, or to take me blood pressure, or to pull a rotten tooth, I just think, well, the vet will take care of us than the NHS. There's no way, how we got here is a different discussion. But that is legitimately true. The dogs and the horses and the cats have got better health care than us in this country.
Remarkable. So it's like going through a time warp back to like 1950s NHS or something. There's a matron on the ward, and
yeah, that's what it's like. This is what it used to be like
with a white coat with a stethoscope,
Yeah, I even got like a little pack of very special dog food when I left. I mean, of course, like now, what's going to happen is, because certain people on the right have got these takes where I'm like a closet libertarian, and now they're going to be sitting there listening to this and say, oh, well, here we go. It's all about the private medical. It's arguments for libertarian healthcare and everything. But I'm just saying, like, again, it's legitimately true that what I've seen in the vets, I've also been to the NHS for something about a year ago. And it was like being a war zone. It was like being in Beirut. It was terrible. And I look at the vets and I think, yeah, it's just objectively better. It's like what the NHS would have been in the 1960s.
Yeah,
I'm not kidding now. The couple of times I've had to take my daughter to A&E or something, and thank God it's only been like once or twice in the past 4 years. War zone is an understatement. I mean, Jesus, and it's like you don't know where they're coming from. It's like you look under the chair and there's another 6 like Indian kids or whatever. It's incredible. It's horrible. Anyway, just on the free market economic stuff. In the absence of Horus this week, I'm gonna have to like take a time warp back to me like 5 years ago, drawing on all my libertarian knowledge to point out where Curtis does an absolute hatchet job on libertarians in this documentary, because I'm pretty sure he mentioned some pretty well-known economists like James Buchanan and people like that. So when that time comes, I'll have to don the Horus mantle this week and try.
So we're in like a prequel sequence where you're going back to being Senator Palpatine, looking kind of normal.
Well, because that was essentially Horus's role, wasn't it, to kind of stick up for free market economics, And
I think he got a necessary amount of stick on that. I think it's he's a very, very worthy historian to read, and I recommend his Substack again.
Yeah, he's got some very good stuff. On that subject, Morgoth, where can people find you these days, sir?
I'm still on YouTube and Substack. I've been a little bit quiet this week because obviously I've had things to deal with. But Substack is where everything that I do, including this, always ends up with Substack. So, I mean, this is the first live stream I've done for months. I've made like a thing a while ago on Substack saying I'm streamed out. I'm gonna kind of just put it on the back burner and concentrate on my own stuff for a while. But everything that I do goes on Substack. So if I make appearances off platform, all of that goes on Substack. Almost everything's open to the public. And then once a month, I do like a little podcast because people haven't got time to read all of the articles. So I do like a little catch-up monthly review podcast where I read through all of the articles of the month and have a bit of a natter with whatever's on my mind and that kind of thing. And I do that. That's for the subscribers at the end of each month.
I have sorry to interrupt you, Morgoth, but I didn't know you did that, and then I caught the last one you did, the September one, and there's a bit in there which is just fantastic where you imagine Elon Musk. You imagine Elon Musk colonizes Mars, right? but then it turns out to be like an absolute dystopian fiction. And you're just imagining these people, like the ideology they develop, and then what happens down, like Earth is even worse, and what happens in their relations.
Yeah.
And an elderly Elon Musk going back up. That is brilliant, that piece. I have to mention that.
Cheers. I mean, the idea, what I was trying to get at was that there's this assumption where, because I think it's interesting what Elon Musk's doing on Mars. And as I said, I think it's weird that he'll own a libtard and get like 500,000 likes, but he'll send like a pod up to Mars and take some photographs and it'll get like 20,000 likes. And it's always been of his sort of oeuvre. I mean, this week it has really caught on, I suppose. But what I was going for was like, your liberal principles are not going to hold up if you have to have a kind of outpost on Mars. Like, that's going to be tested to the limit. And I also was, thinking, would this be the sort of conditions to create like a new civilization entirely with its own sort of spirit? And is this what it will be like to sort of mingle in? But basically, this kind of Gen X liberalism would not survive if you got like 3,000 or 4,000 people on Mars. Decisions are going to have to be made and things are going to have to be done. The pressure will be on people where your 90s liberalism just is not going to survive for very long. And that's kind of the picture that I was painting. I did have a good laugh with it. Like,
it's the current problem, isn't it? It's because I referenced a book in a few streams we've done, Ken Holling's book called Welcome to Mars, and it's subtitled The Fantasy of Science in the American Century. And he says the future in the 1950s, the flying cars kind of vision, it was written about and discussed and analyzed with such confidence that it took on an almost tangible presence. And the problem we're faced with is the sort of impedance mismatch with all of those hopes and dreams to actually meet with a human response, a human framework to actually manage the visions of the future. There is, as you say, there's no answers in people's political and moral compass at the moment. There's just the sort of hype for the dream. Yeah,
you can see with the aesthetics that there was some pictures came out the other day, and it was like the future will be self-automated cars, and it was like a sort of bus tram thing. But it looked it was that hauntology thing where it looked like a futuristic version of the aesthetics of the 1950s of what they thought would be the future.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, we're 60 years late, but we're back on track. But we're going to have these like big sort of chrome boilers on like self-automated buses, because, as you say, they don't actually know what it should be according to the sort of spirit of our own age. This is it's the trap.
It ends up being kitsch, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's like, well, we're finally back on track. We're finally getting back to the 1950s in space.
Just before we get on to this, the first thing I should mention, since I've been, I've done the revamp, and we're now in the revamp era, I made the mistake of clicking on one of these YouTube, like, if you want to have more views on YouTube, do these 5 tricks. Well, I clicked on one of them, and now I just get spammed every time I log in. There's another like 5 of them, and it's just killing me with them. But every once in a while, I'm like, oh, okay, let's just see what the. So I keep on clicking on them, so it keeps on sending me more. So it's kind of a self. I've even opened up an incognito tab, so it's like YouTube doesn't know I'm opening it, so it stops sending me them. But one of the things they all talk about, because I mean the level of cynicism in these maximization of views videos is incredible. Like they advocate, for example, doing a video, waiting to see what the high points and low points are in audience retention, and then going back through and literally just cutting out. There's that post edit tool, just cutting out all the bits that people dipped, so that previous, so it's only highs. Like people go to those sorts of levels. But one of the things that they talk about is, don't tell people to like and subscribe at the end of the video. Do it in the middle when everybody's waiting for you to get onto the Adam Curtis thing. So I tell you what, guys, if you're enjoying this chat, like and subscribe, and maybe pick up a course at the academic agency. All right, now I've done that. We can get on to the trap. I have to mention that this is actually the first Adam Curtis documentary I ever saw. I remember it going out live, and this is what got me into Curtis's work in the first place, The Trap. What was particularly interesting for me back then, and this was during Tony Blair years, is that this was one of the few documentaries that seriously looked in a critical way at what the Blair government was doing and what its kind of animating principles were. And to my knowledge, it remains the only serious critique of Blairism that was put out on the BBC during the Blair years. Yeah, there was plenty of like anti-Iraq war talk, but that's a different issue, right? This is like looking at the nuts and bolts, mechanics, and first principles, I guess, of what was animating people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And this gave it like an automatic interest to me because it was so different from anything else that was going. Like this was, don't forget, this went out on BBC Two, and it's a documentary talking about like Isaiah Berlin and you know, Nash equilibrium and things like that. It was mind blowing to me when I saw this as a young man. So
yeah, because after the Power of Nightmares, I remember in the press, because Curtis was still quite a mysterious figure at this time. People didn't really know much about him. There weren't that many interviews or even pictures of him out there. And what he'd said after Power of Nightmares was he wanted to make a series about altruism, and he was trying to figure out how to do it. And for me, it's, as I said way back, I see this as a sort of the last bit of what I call his Tony Blair quadrilogy, because it sort of starts with the Mayfair set, then the Century of the Self, then the Power of Nightmares. They're all kind of laying the groundwork for this kind of sort of, you know, apotheosis of the Blair ideology, if you like. And that's where we sort of end up with The Trap, as you say, laying it out.
yeah, one of the things that I'm going to be looking out for going through The Trap this time is whether Curtis ever shows any awareness of people like James Burnham or managerialism as an idea or elite theory in general. That's one thing that, because it seems like Curtis has got all the materials in place to draw some of the conclusions that we have drawn in the past few years. It's all there. It's all in these documentaries. But I actually wonder if this was a kind of blind spot for him, or if he'd never like read The Managerial Revolution or something like that.
He certainly refers to managerialism as being one of the sort of the crushing ideologies of our age in his interviews. So he doesn't explicitly ever reference Burnham, I don't think, but he's certainly aware of it, if you like, without describing it in those terms.
All right, let's make a start. And Morgoth, you've seen these before, so you know the drill. But if you've got something you want to say, you just say pause, and I'll pause it. All right.
All right.
Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The ultimate political goal at the heart of our age is the idea of individual freedom.
I believe that freedom is the future of all humanity.
Boomer Truth Regime is just a straight rip of Adam Curtis, isn't it? It's ridiculous how clear that is now that I'm watching it back.
And we've already hit Areno as well, on a faraway.
Yeah. Sorry for pausing it straight away, but
In Britain, our government has set out to create a revolution that will free individuals from the control of old elites and bureaucracies. A new world where we are free to choose our lives, not be trapped by class or income into predestined roles.
To liberate Britain from all the old class divisions, old structures, old prejudices.
To liberate the individual.
And abroad, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Britain and America have set out to liberate individuals from tyranny. For those leading it, it is just a first step in a global revolution for democracy. But if one steps back and looks at what has resulted, it is a very strange kind of freedom. The attempt to liberate people from the dead hand of bureaucracy has led to the rise of a new and increasingly controlling system of management, driven by targets and numbers. While governments committed to creating freedom of choice in all areas have actually presided over a rise of inequalities and a dramatic collapse in social mobility. consequence has been a return of the power of class and privilege. And abroad, the attempt to create democracy has led not just to bloody mayhem, but a rejection of the American-led campaign to bring freedom.
Go home, Yankee! Go home, Yankee! We're here for your fucking freedom!
They were chanting "Go home, Yankee." Go home, Yankee.
Back up right now!
And it has summoned up an anti-democratic authoritarian Islamism. This, in turn, has helped inspire terrorist attacks in Britain itself. In response, the government has dismantled long-standing laws designed to protect our freedom. This is a series of films about how this strange, paradoxical world came to be created. It begins in the dark and frightening days of the Cold War. And it will show how what we have today is a very narrow and peculiar idea of freedom that was born out of the paranoia of that time. It is based on an image of human beings as selfish, isolated and suspicious creatures who constantly monitor and strategize against each other. The films will show how politicians and scientists came to believe that this idea of human nature could be the basis of a new type of free society. But what none of them would realise was that within this dark and distrustful vision lay the seeds of a new and revolutionary system of social control. It would use the language of freedom, but in reality it would come to entrap us and our leaders.
There's that long corridor again, Simon.
Lovely, lovely
Signature
classic stuff.
Curtis.
Mm.
In a narrow and empty world.
Freedom, freedom. Here comes the freedom man. On this day.
At the end of the Second World War, America and American films celebrated not just victory, but what many believed would be the dawning of a new era.
USA. I'm singing a song of freedom.
Back then, freedom meant not just liberation from the Nazis, but also from the economic chaos and uncertainty that had caused the depression of the 1930s. Governments now believed that their role was to manage and control the economy and protect society from the dangerous self-interest at the heart of capitalism.
Why can't we?
No longer did we worship at the shrine of no-holds-barred capitalism. No, we had been through the depression of the 1930s. We had been through World War II. Now we were talking about the need for government to be the major balancing element in the economy. The individual was still important, but government would make sure that we would never slide into a deep depression again.
Now we've talked about this before, but this week we have Morgoth with us. I have come to quite appreciate that little period after World War II where the government was like, yeah, we're going to govern and we're going to be paternalistic and we're going to look after our people for a while. And it, you know, it's funny, I've been looking at the Hammer horror stuff recently, but I was looking in the history of British film, and like every step of the way, the British government was like, yeah, we're going to need to protect our film industry. We need to make sure that we project an image to the world. And then it's like, fast forward to Thatcher. Oh, Thatcher sold it all off, or Thatcher just let the Americans come in, or let all these studios go out of business, and so we didn't have a film industry anymore after Thatcher. Oh, brilliant! You know.
Yeah. One of the strange things is that if you know when you look on Twitter or on social media, you see these clips going around of the 1940s, the 1950s, or
Yes.
the 1960s, and everything is so. It's got this kind of glow of nostalgia to it, and everybody's like, "Oh, what have we lost? What happened?" I did a video last year, I think, where there was one in Liverpool. There was a street in Liverpool like then and now, comparing it, and I really trying to drill into what is it then, because yes, you've got the nostalgia and you've got this everything, this nice, you know, obviously the demographics are different, so you've got all of that, but what I noticed as well was that because we talk about like the state intervention and whatnot. In the 1960s and 1950s, when you see these kind of pictures of bucolic England, it's surprising how little regulation there is. And it sounds like a kind of trite point, but the one in Liverpool was a very clean street. It was well kept. The roads were nice. But then when you look at it, it's mainly that an absence of intrusion. And when you look at the one which was from like 2021 or something, you've got like these big iron grids which the council have placed over empty houses, and then you say, well, okay, why are these houses empty? Then you've got signs everywhere, you've got markings on the road everywhere. There's like everywhere you look, there's this regulation and signs of the bureaucracy which was to come. And I think you get this golden moment where the state will stop the citizens being preyed upon by raw capital, but then to where then it becomes overly intrusive and bloated itself and begins once again to make people's lives misery. And so you get this little bit there where everything, the balance is correct. But again, this is why I'm accused of being libertarian. But the fact is, it is just the sheer, if you look at these comparison photos of then and now, it is the sheer amount of council intrusion, regulation, and bullshit little rules and safety stuff, which has just ruined everything.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the post-war settlement, what you had was a broad level of protection from the government from outside forces, by which I mean foreign companies and things like that. So it'd be like, right, well, okay, even if we're making a loss here for a while, this steel factory is safe for a bit, because the government is just going to make sure that is kept open. Or, the film industry, like I said, even if it's not making that much money, the government is going to make sure that keeps on going as a matter of national prestige or something. But on the ground level, people were basically left to get on with it, to kind of, there weren't that many rules and regulations on the ground. And I think this is something that people on our side of things actually see the connection between, for example, letting in lots and lots of people from foreign countries, and now there's actually a problem that the state has to intervene, i.e., how do you actually stop the local population revolting against this, or how do you stop them being rude, let's say, to these unwanted guests? And all of a sudden you've got a need for, hate speech or whatever else. There's a whole kind of bullshit bureaucracy that gets built around this new problem that didn't even exist in the past. Many other things as well.
I mean, I'll save all of my takes for later on when we get into this, but I think the critical failure of this entire model, which we're going to explore here, is how easy it is to game. Like, the game can be gamed if you've got certain allegiances. And so it has to come up with answers to why things are not really working, but we'll come on to all that, I suppose.
I'm interested to ask Morgoth, because I'm from a similar part of the country. I'm from the northeast of England, although I don't sound like it. I have this slightly fake accent. But I'm interested to ask him about that thing of the post-war consensus, the Attlee government coming in, the social welfare state, and a lot of the stuff we've talked about in terms of nostalgia for the past that was looking like a rosy future was ahead. And we're from areas that are tribally old Labour areas. I'm from Hartlepool. You're from, further up in Newcastle way, aren't you? And I wonder about what's your sense of, even though, those areas embrace Labour government and if you like, the sort of supports of the bigger state, the welfare state, how much do you sense of the persistence of working class reactionary sentiment goes through that history? Because it's a sort of a thing that I'm encountering with, there's a lot of progressives who have nostalgia for that past in quite a reactionary way themselves.
I mean, there was a sense that everything was just settled up until Thatcher, which again is something we'll come on to with all of this. And I think in a way, when you think of the shipbuilding, when you think of the coaling industry, and the unions, there was a sense that we've made it and we've got it pretty good. In actual fact, but I mean, but when you look back at it, a lot of these photos don't actually look that great. Like there'll be a progressive who'll say, you know, there's mold on the walls and the streets are kind of filthy, but there is another side to this. The progressives do have a kind of story to tell. But by and large, I think people didn't really think about it because they were just settled in their place and in their time. But the foundations that they were sitting on, say coal mines being an obvious sort of metaphor, is that, well, in actual fact, this isn't going to last forever, bucko. And there are larger forces at play which are going to tear your life apart and just dissolve your communities, which were a little way off. But for that moment as well, where the government would come in, like up where I am, you've got all of these places where there's monuments to people who died in the mines. And there was a sense, especially after the wars, that this has to be regulated. You can't just have people dying in these coal mines. So the government would come in and have talks with the unions, and you'd get better shafts and you'd get exits and things like that. So this, as AA was saying, this is all fair enough. But I think the big mistake was that they didn't actually, it was a sense that they thought it was all just going to last forever, and it didn't, and it came down hard and fast.
I think I mean, I've mentioned this before. Last time I went back to Wales, we took a little bit of a trip to the valleys, which I don't go to. Remember, I went to that old coffee shop and stuff, and we stopped off at this a former coal mine that is now a museum. And you know, I was looking through all of the kind of display they had there. Couldn't help but notice that they had a lot of Soviet, like straight up communist literature in there. They had their own working men's clubs and unions and so on. But I don't think it should be underestimated the extent to which some of these guys were straight up like full on communists, you know. See, this is a thing though. If you suggested to any of those, I don't know, transsexual rights or homosexuality or something, they would have probably punched you, right? But they were still, like, from their own point of view, they actually supported things like the entire nationalization of the coal industry for workers' rights and things like that, you know. So, yeah, sorry, go on, Morgoth.
A story just on the point that Simon raised as well. That people forget, and I've told this story before on streams and whatnot, and people are shocked by it. But in the 1990s, in Northumberland and in the Northeast, women were banned from going in the bars of social clubs. It just wasn't allowed. And what would happen would be that on a Sunday, my dad would go around to he'd be sitting in the club, and the club would be packed. The bar, it would just be completely packed with men playing cards. And my mother would be making the Sunday dinner, and I would have to go, and I would have been like 7 or 8 years old, or maybe a little bit older as well. It happened throughout my childhood. And I had to go around, go to the club and go in. I was allowed in to tell me dad that his dinner would be out in 20 minutes and he'd have to go. And when you went there, there'd be like loads of BMXs outside of the club, the social club, because everybody was coming down to tell their dads that a dinner would be ready soon. And then they would jack in their hand of cards and wander around. And for the fact that women just were not allowed in the bar. And people are amazed by that. But you can see as well, like, there was that kind of, I don't think it was ever just outlawed. It just became something which was untenable. I remember in the early 2000s on New Year's Day, it became a bit of a free for all. Like, standards were just there in free fall. But yeah, that was a thing, and it was there with good reason, which I could get into, but we got to get going. But basically, if women were allowed in the bar, men wanted to swear in the bar and they wanted to say whatever they wanted. And if somebody's sister or wife or mother took offense, it would lead to tensions between the men, because somebody would be saying, like, will you watch your language? Me wife's here or me mother's here. And then they would say, well, she shouldn't be here. And so what they decided to do was to just ban women so that they couldn't be offended. And they were allowed in the lounge and the concert room. And all of this was set in stone. And it was, now you look at it and it was deeply socially conservative, but it was just took for granted. And it was kind of just common sense as well.
And that's an interesting word you use there, standards, because there's a lot of sentimentalism about being the working class in Britain. And, things that persist in my memory were, there really were people in Hartlepool in the 1970s who would scrub the step of the front door. There'd be a sense of people. I mean, there's a lot of cliches, about poverty, I suppose, in towns like that, where people say things like "we was poor, but we was happy" and all that kind of stuff. But there was a like you say, a conservatism that was there that was not aspirational necessarily in the later conservative sense of the 80s, the kind of grab everything and fill your barrow as high as you can. But there was certainly we want to present as decent people. And we do have these kind of, like you said about the street in Liverpool, there was a great degree of self-regulation of communities that persisted.
One of the problems, though, just before we move on, is that when you live like that, this is all things which are just learned and taken for granted. It's just the way things are.
Yeah.
And when you come up against a leftist, with a bunch of theory and some ideological talking points, you find that they actually cut through that like butter, because the people do not have the intellectual sophistication to push back. This is one of the reasons why I ended up getting involved with sort of being more outspoken online when I go because of what I saw on the BNP Facebook page back in the day, when I saw all of these working class people whose hearts were in the right place, but they just couldn't articulate what they wanted to say properly. And I wanted to be a kind of on their team type thing. But it's a recurring thing I've seen all my life.
I mean, one of the easy areas you can see this, right? Back in the old days, and you don't even have to go back that far, because I remember it happening even when I was a kid, is that once upon a time, people would just settle their differences by going outside or having a fight, or let's say somebody was bang out of line, they just beat the shit out of him, right? Well, of course, if you do that now, it's a court case. It becomes legal really quickly, or there'll be some there'll be some regulation or intervention by the law. Whereas there was a kind of understanding that the police would just turn a blind eye to all that sort of stuff back in the day, because it would be like, they'd know the policeman, and he'd be like, well, it's fair enough, he was asking for it type thing. And you had a local policeman, and he kind of figured. But I would say by the 1990s, and certainly by the time Blair was the Prime Minister, you just couldn't do that sort of stuff anymore. If you punch someone, you'd have a court case, right? Now,
yeah.
Or just even using industrial language to them.
Oh yeah, you use off-color language.
Just being direct with people,
You've hurt his feelings, so now you've got a court case.
In the following years, the bureaucracies at the heart of the state grew enormously. Their job was to regulate capitalism for the benefit of everyone. In an age of optimism, there were few who challenged this new vision. But one man on the margins was convinced it would lead to disaster. He was an Austrian aristocrat called Friedrich von Hayek, who had fled the Nazis and now taught at the University of Chicago. Hayek was convinced that the use of politics...
Now, in the defense of Horus, I have to mention F.A. Hayek is one of the premier Austrian economists. And for Curtis to introduce him with this kind of booming, sinister music is... I mean, he's a pretty well-known guy, Hayek. So I'm just doing Horus, if you're listening, I'm trying to hold up your end of the...
But that is a general thing about this particular series as well, is there are these kind of cues and sort of all music and visual codes that sort of slightly cast a sinister aspect across some of these people, and I've taken different views since first seeing this series of some of the people in this, like Laing and so on. So don't always be manipulated by Curtis's prefiguration that he uses in his sound codes and his framing.
It is interesting though, because Hayek, I don't know if Curtis, I can't remember if Curtis mentions this, but if you read Hayek, he, at one point, I can't remember exactly where it is he says it, but he says he's asked like by an interviewer or something, what's your ideal government? And he basically says like, my ideal government would be a computer that just says no. And I find that interesting because now we're getting close to like government by AI. And I mean, if you just put in the controls where the AI turns down most things, you're close to Hayek's ideal. Like we're getting there, basically. So anyway.
Politics to plan society was far more dangerous than any problems produced by capitalism, because it inevitably led to tyranny and the end of freedom. The terrible example that Hayek pointed to was the Soviet Union. In their search for a utopia, the Soviet leaders had tried to plan and control everything, but this had led them into tyranny and dictatorship. The same would now inevitably happen to the West, he said. It was on what he called the road to serfdom. The only way of avoiding disaster was to go back into the past, back to a golden age of the free market, where individuals followed their own self-interest, and government played little or no role.
Pause.
Out of this would come...
Go on.
I find these, that's like the Germans' emperor. It's a Kaiser, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it.
And it's what's strange is that he's talking about how this great new future would be free enterprise and individualism, and what he's showing there is like Prussian socialism, where it would be like the total state and everybody within the state and nothing outside of it. And I find it kind of it's like the opposite of what I could understand it if he had like cowboys sort of whimsically riding across the plain as John Wayne individuals, but he's got like the opposite of what it is that he's actually describing. And when you put it into a longer historical context, like the reason you could argue like that's the reason why Germany had to be put down.
Yeah, is it the Kaiser's Germany, or is it, given that Hayek was Austrian, is this from like Vienna or Geneva or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, it could be, yeah.
Because, I mean, I think Mises and Hayek and all them, they look back to the old Austria-Hungarian Empire, basically, which was, despite being an empire, fairly free market by the end, as I understand things. I'm going to get Apostolic Majesty like roaring into the comments now. It was not free market, he'll say, but you know, relatively, it was kind of cosmopolitan. Geneva was, but I don't know where this footage is from, but it could be, you know.
What Hayek called a self-directing automatic system, a spontaneous order created by millions of people pursuing their own gain.
We will benefit our fellow men most if we are guided solely by the striving for gain. For this purpose, we have to return to an automatic system which brings this about, self-directing automatic system which alone can restore to liberty and prosperity. That is my fundamental conception.
Isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? What about altruism? Where does that come in?
It doesn't come in.
Hayek's ideas were dismissed by politicians and economists.
Pause.
The notion that one could create social...
Just to say briefly, that's a clip from an interview he did with Bernard Levin in 1980, and I'll post the full clip on Twitter after this. But it's quite interesting in that, alluding to what AA said earlier, Hayek is asked about what he thinks about the idea of parliament and democracy, and he says, well, you know, essentially the idea is that it is a system that is governed, you know, by the opinions of people, if you like, distilled through their elected representatives, you know, the populist delusion in a sense, you know, and he says, you know, Bernard Levin questions him and says, you know, well, do you think that's really the case? And Hayek does look quite doubtful. He says, well, if it's true, I'm not quite certain it is, but I hope so. So, you know, you could sense he knew where things were at.
Order in a modern complex world simply by unleashing individual self-interest was seen as a failed and discredited idea. But proof that he might be right was about to emerge from the most unlikely of sources, from scientists struggling with the new, terrifying uncertainties of the Cold War. This is the heart of a giant, blast-proof bunker 30 miles north of New York. Built in the late 50s, it housed the largest computer in the world, linked to a system of radars around the world, which constantly watched the Soviet Union. Every second, thousands of pieces of information poured into this room to be analysed for signs of danger. The nuclear strategists who had designed this system knew they were dealing with a completely new type of conflict. Neither side could let it get out of control because of the terrifying consequences. So the strategists wanted to find a way of using the information to anticipate what the Soviets might be about to do. And to do this, they turned to a new idea called game theory. Game theory had been developed as a way of mathematically analysing poker games. It looked at the game as a system where the players are locked together, each trying to work out what the other thinks they will do. From that, game theory showed rationally what the best moves were for each of the players.
This is a type of war that had never been fought before. And of course, as we all know, it would be so devastating that it's almost impossible to consider all of its consequences. They still wanted to say that there was a rational way to approach such a virtual war. And game theory seemed to offer that to them, that you could, in a sense, incorporate your enemy.
Sorry to interrupt, but this is another Curtis trope that we've not really commented on, Simon, until now. There's the long corridor, right? But he also loves the people sitting at big old-fashioned computers and machines. You're not quite sure what they do, right? But he loves this imagery as well, and it's been through all of his documentaries so far. So just thought I'd comment on it. I'll also comment on the fact that it struck me a number of times that I feel our leaders now have abandoned all of this. This game, like, okay, you could say, well, game theory, you know, but at least it was rational. When I look at our leaders now, I don't believe that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are doing game theory with Putin. I get no sense that any of our leaders, whether it's Starmer or Macron or any of them, are game theorying it out with Vladimir Putin. I feel like they just we're on a runaway train and we're on the mad side of the mad doctrine or whatever. Like nobody acts like a war with Russia now is a fate worse than death. Whereas back then it was taken as read that this was mutually assured destruction. But now people don't think like that.
It is weirdly casual, isn't it? Because I don't know if either of you have been aware, but recently it was the 40th anniversary of the broadcast of Threads, the film about, you know, a sort of counterfactual about the possibility of nuclear war in the early 80s in Britain. And for those of us of a certain age, I mean, it's quite a scarring kind of film, you know, and they just recently showed it again, I think only for the third time. And you do wonder that people have become detached from the prospect of what a nuclear war might actually involve. And so this sort of flip way that it's being dealt with. Go on, Morgoth.
Well, I was completely traumatized by the Threads. There was the When the Wind Blows, and then there was lots of depictions. I mean, the Terminator one was one of the later ones, and I was horrified by that. I saw Terminator 1 as a young boy, way before I should have done, in this apocalyptic vision. So all of this was kind of burned into your psychology. But today, something like Threads would be probably seen as kind of Russian propaganda or something, because what you're doing is kind of stoking up the fear, because the politicians are coming out and they're saying that's not going to happen. He's all talk. He's all bluster. Don't worry about nuclear war. And they're not saying like they're not like, where is your safe space to go? Where is it duck and cover? Like that was all nonsense, you know. The idea that you could hide under your kitchen table when like a thermonuclear blast went off, and your like napkins and wet towels would protect you from it and radiation. That was just all like sort of nonsense to keep people like living in hope so they wouldn't riot on the streets. The government policies on the Cold War in general, so that the lefties, the anti-nuclear lefty types, all their ranks would swell up and all of this. So they had to pacify the population by just telling them outright lies. Yeah, put a wet tea towel over a kitchen table, you'll be grand. You're not, are you? But today, that kind of rhetoric would be regarded as somehow being like anti-regime, that you were stoking up fear and it was misinformation and all of that kind of thing, which tells you like quite a bit, really. And that kind of reinforces AA's opinion that we're in uncharted territory here. I mean, what they've been doing is saying that they can keep pushing Putin, and because he hasn't reacted so far, he won't react in the future either, which I just regard as insanity, absolute insanity.
Well, I mean, I can't help but feel a parallel. I remember on your on that show, on that September review show of your own, Morgoth, you mentioned about how Israel is like that little kid that's poking a slightly bigger kid at the yard, right? With regards to Iran, it keeps on poking. It's kind of irritating, you know. But I like that is also the policy towards Russia writ large. Just keep on poking the bear, and it's like, I mean, I don't know what you call it, like the chutzpah strategy, or the kind of you know, keep on annoying your enemies strategy. I don't know what you'd call it, but it's the complete opposite to the Cold War.
And you see in both the cases, Russia and Iran are being forced into a situation where they will have to react, whether they want to or not. And people get into all this stuff about, well, they've got agency. You know, Putin's got agency. He doesn't have to do that. He didn't have to invade in Ukraine. I mean, this is what they're going to move on to. There's a bit of Mearsheimer in this, because Mearsheimer kind of comes across now. He fits with what they're talking about, this Cold War realism, and he's kind of like this relic of a bygone era. And instead of being on the biggest TV shows, or instead of actually writing policy, he's like doing podcasts with Judge Knapp, and like the most capable people are way out on the periphery, giving their takes on this stuff. Where we've got like people like Kamala Harris and Chip Shop Debs in places of influence. It's madness.
Yeah, but it's kind of, what interests me about Mearsheimer is that if you're in a situation where all of the actors are rational, which it seems to be the case now, or you've got somebody like Netanyahu in Israel, who just seems to be a guy with zero breaks, zero limits, like he just does not play by the rules. Does your realist analysis cease to be realist? This is a question I keep on asking. Is like, well, is it still realism if all of the people are mad? Like, because the rational assumption goes out the window. So yeah. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's out the window. I think it's a major flaw in your thinking.
Into your own thinking, that you could mathematically understand what your enemy would do, to the point where you and your enemy will play the exact same set of strategies.
The Center for Developing Nuclear Strategy was a military think tank called the RAND Corporation. And the strategists at RAND used game theory to create mathematical models that predicted how the Soviets would behave in response to what they saw the Americans doing. Out of this came the fundamental structure of the nuclear age. Hundreds of missiles protected in silos underground, and fleets of bombers in the air 24 hours a day. Just as in a game, they were strategic moves to convince the Soviets that if they attacked, America would always have enough missiles to destroy them in return. And in the rules of this game, fear and self-interest stopped the Russians from attacking, but it created a stable equilibrium called the delicate balance of terror.
Recommending missiles underground, missiles and submarines and all that was a way of making that much more stable. Sometimes the way I used to explain it is we're trying very hard to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war by creating powerful incentives for the Russians not to start a nuclear war, because we're trying to give them incentives not to attack, either a nuclear attack or with a conventional attack. Yeah, so incentives are important in that.
Underlying game theory was a dark vision of human beings who were driven only by self-interest, constantly distrustful of those around them.
One of the things as well that I find about the Middle East and this subject is that for the last 20 years, you know, we were talking about rational actors and sort of being locked in this poker game with each other and doing the rational calculations as to how each would move. And for all the last 20, 25 years, we've been told that Iran was the irrational loon, where the narrative would be that you have to understand you can't actually deal with these people. They're not like us. They're religious fundamentalists. They believe they're going to go to heaven. They're bringing on this new Mehdi Messiah. It's like it's all this esoteric stuff. But don't worry about that. The fact is they're not rational. They're living in la la land, and if they get a nuke, all bets are off the table, because these kinds of, as he was talking about, incentives and these calculations, they won't work. And in actual fact, what we've seen is that it's America who's shackled to the loons. It's America who's shackled to the messianic, we have a vision of a great Israeli empire across the region. And the Iranians who are doing these, the retaliations are carefully calculated. So it's like, yeah, well, we have to strike back to save face, but we have to make sure we're not going to drop bombs on a hospital. We'll hit this air base somewhere. We'll take out this missile defense system. Whereas if they were as they had been depicted by the regime, they would have just been raining down rockets on synagogues and shopping centers and the whole thing. So like what they're saying is here applies now to America rather more than anybody else in the world.
Yeah, I'd agree. I would agree with all of that, basically. Yeah.
And there was a mathematician at the Rand Corporation who would take this dark vision much further. He set out to show that one could create stability.
By the way, Rand Corporation is. Do you remember our Adam Curtis bingo cards? I'm pretty certain mention of the Rand Corporation is an Adam Curtis bingo as well.
Yeah. I mean, Rand, for people who don't know, started roughly in 1947-48, and essentially is the first kind of major think tank, as we call it now. What they say on their own website is what Rand was interested in was systems and ways of doing things rather than particular devices, particular instrumentalities, particular weapons. And we are concerned not merely with the physical aspects of these systems, but with the human behavior side as well. And they had a chief strategist, a guy called Herman Kahn, who he was the one who posited the idea that nuclear war was winnable. In 1960, he wrote a book on thermonuclear war, and apparently the character of Dr. Strangelove is actually based on him, because I think in the film they call it the Bland Corporation.
Through suspicion and self-interest, not just in the Cold War, but in the whole of human society. He was the mathematical genius, John Nash. Nash was portrayed in the Hollywood film A Beautiful Mind as a tortured hero. In reality, Nash was difficult and spiky. He was notorious at Rand for inventing a series of cruel games. The most famous he called Fuck You, Buddy.
I should mention that when I used to teach the play Glengarry Glen Ross, I would make the students play Fuck You, Buddy. I actually looked up the rules and I made the students play it. Fascinating to watch. So I just thought I'd mention that.
In which the only way to win was to ruthlessly betray your game partner. Nash took game theory and tried to apply it to all forms of human interaction. To do this, he made the fundamental assumption that all human behavior was exactly like that involved in the hostile, competitive world of the nuclear standoff. that human beings constantly watched and monitored each other, and to get what they wanted, they would adjust their strategies to each other. In a series of equations for which he would win the Nobel Prize, Nash showed that a system driven by suspicion and selfishness did not have to lead to chaos. He proved that there could always be a point of equilibrium in which everyone's self-interest was perfectly balanced against each other.
The equilibrium, this equilibrium which is used, is that what I do is perfectly adjusted in relation to what you are doing. And what you're doing, or what any other person is doing, is perfectly adjusted to what I'm doing or what all other people are doing. They are seeking separate optimization, just like poker players.
Is each player alone?
That's the idea, that they are alone, they're separate. Doing something that is very non-cooperative, but very selfish.
Was it there? I mean, I actually disagree with this model. I think it's such a bad model that I made a whole little note thing. I mean, because what I put is you can actually predict how he'd react. Would assume right. So if you let's just say that me and you are going to get in on this caper, and I've got the money and you've got the diamond, would you rip me off? Like I would not rip you off. And if the diamond was gone, I'd think, okay, I'm taking a major L here, and it's bad news. But I would actually assume that you would be honest about it.
Right. Yeah.
But whereas if I was dealing, and in my notes I put if on the other hand I was in the caper and it was with Constantine kissing, I would just assume that he was going to rip me off. And so. Yeah. And so there's it's a bit more nuanced. The people have baggage, and they have these connections and mutual understandings, which isn't accounted for whatsoever in this. Let alone the fact that you've got that little moral sort of worm in your ear saying you're being a piece of shit if you just rip this fella off. I don't think that this totally morally indifferent model is actually how people operate in the real world, which is why it's so bad. But I think what happens is if you're going to force it top down on everybody, then yeah, you're going to create a big mess, and I think that's what's happened.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that with regards to someone like Kissing or David Baddiel, let's say, because I actually wonder if, let's say, people of that ilk would have the same thought as you, Morgoth, right? I.e., well, if it's with anybody else from an outside group, then it's the Nash, then you're full fuck you buddy Nash, right? But if it's from somebody from the in-group, then there's a different set of rules at play. And this is actually something that has gone right through history. It's like, well, usury is banned for brothers, right? You're not meant to do it to someone who's part of your own group, but it's all right to do it with outsiders.
Yeah,
so it's two separate different rules.
It's like what we saw in The Century of the Self when Bernays is taking Freud's ideas, and it's this thing again of people like Bernays and Walter Lippmann thinking in terms of aggregate populations of people, and that these guys here at Rand, or even back then with Bernays and PR, devising systems to manipulate at scale, people as preferential groups, that you can deal with individuals on the basis of sentiment, but this is a way of sort of mass formation control that is centered around thinking in terms of aggregates. And not of those individuals. Like you say, you'll make the choice depending on the individual and what you know of them and what you suspect of them. And I mean, it's interesting to talk about when you did the Fuck You Buddy game with your students. Do you remember any observations about it? Curtis goes on to sort of note that, the women tended to counteract the effect of the sort of inbuilt cynicism.
Yeah, they would. Some of them would. Yeah. And yeah, I'm trying to. I mean, there's a few of those games I played, and it really depends on how switched on they were as well. But so I remember there was one I used to play where you would you'd throw out different chocolate bars, right? And I would simply just allocate them. Right, I'd be like, well, you have to have this Mars bar, you have to have the Milky Way or whatever. And then there was a moment I'd say, well, now you can trade. And they'd all swap to get their favorites. And this was meant to be a game to show how trading was more effective than government allocation. But there was one student who was a communist, right, who cottoned onto this and literally collectivized she literally got all of the chocolates together and be like, I tell you what we're going to do, we're going to share. And she broke the game. So I was trying to remember. There was a few of them like that who were like, they could see what the game was designed to do, so they rebelled against it in that way. But most of the time, the rules of the game are such that it kind of pushes you to do the fuck over. To be honest, it pushes you to do the betrayal, which is one of the dark things about it, because and I think what I ended up doing is getting them all to play with each other and keep a score of whether they won or lost. And invariably, the ones who had 6 wins under their belt had done the fuck over every time, whereas there were other people who had like all draws or all losses, and they were like, oh well, I guess I'm just a nice person or whatever, you know. So
do you know how when you play Monopoly, I think I remember some sort of anecdote that the guy who invented Monopoly tried to craft the game so that it would end up with a few people or one person in the game owning virtually everything. And there was a sort of subversive will in the design to illustrate the idea that, you know, capitalism leads to some sense of gross unfairness. And you know, you notice when you play with Monopoly, you know, you're either winning or you're losing. You don't hit those properties, you know, the one that Jim Slater talks about in the Mayfair. So you don't hit those key properties that allow your wealth to sort of, you know, accelerate, and you start losing. And you always notice the person you're playing with, a sort of sadism kind of comes out, and people start to enjoy winning and rubbing your nose in the fact that they've got umpteen hotels on Mayfair, and that it's just a spiral that you cannot get out of.
Those on Christmas Day, we used to play Monopoly after everybody had a good drink, and it was always a disaster. It would always end up in fights at the family, and what you find is like corrupt. Of course, like, you know, everybody's having a drink, but there would be genuine nasty arguments, and what you would get would be people teaming up and corruption. And if some people like checking out and just handing over everything to the next, like sort of the next richest person on the board in order to take out the most powerful one, because they kind of learn to hate them. And then the other thing would happen would be this like autistic going through the rules book and bending the rules. Like if it was possible to get away and reimagining the rules of Monopoly and all of this kind of thing. So it ran completely against the grain of human nature.
I would try to do all those sorts of things of, you know, making off the books deals with people, saying to one player, you know, I'll buy your hotels for well over the asking price, you know, to try and sort of get back into the game, you know, and at that point people would sort of cotton onto what you're doing and just reject it completely.
Yeah, I mean, in the strict rules, you're not allowed to do this, but you can cut like, you know, or I'll allow you to land there next 4 times. You don't have to pay, or 10% deal, whatever. But I know in board game circles, because, you know, I used to be part of board gaming groups. I used to go to this expo. In fact, fairly recently, I'm only talking like past couple of years, I stopped going really. But Monopoly is hated among board game aficionados for basically being like a badly designed game. It's like all of the modern rules of board game design are like, whatever Monopoly does, do the opposite, basically, because it's got too much luck, it's got runaway leader problem, it's got you know, it's not fun, it leads to arguments, all those sorts of things that we're talking about. It's actually just like a bad game from like a pure game design point of view. and board gamers don't like it because it's the one board game everybody's played, right? So people are like, well, I don't like board games because I don't like Monopoly. So, you know, and there are so many better board games. So within board gaming circles, Monopoly has a very bad reputation. You can go to the Board Games Expo. There'll be hundreds of different games played. Not a single person will be playing Monopoly there. I can guarantee you that.
And then what all of them do works together, and deriving from that, there is a payoff to all the players. That is the equilibrium. But it's understood not to be a cooperative ideal.
But the stability, the equilibrium, would only happen if everyone involved behaved selfishly. Because if they cooperated, the result became unpredictable and dangerous. A famous game was developed at Rand to show that in any interaction, selfishness always led to a safer outcome. It was called the prisoner's dilemma. There are many versions, but all of them involve two players having to decide whether to trust or to betray each other. Imagine you have stolen the world's most valuable diamond. You have agreed to sell it to a dangerous gangster. He offers to meet you to exchange the diamond for the money, but you think he may kill you. So instead, you tell him you will take it to a remote field and hide it, while at the same time, he must go to another field hundreds of miles away and hide the money. Then you will call him, and each will tell the other the hiding place. But just as you are about to make the call, you realize you could betray him. You keep the diamond, and then you go and get the money, while the gangster searches fruitlessly in an empty field. But at the very same moment, you realize that he is probably thinking the same thing, that he could betray you. You have no way of predicting how the other person will behave. That is the dilemma. But what Nash's equation showed was that the rational choice was always to betray the other person, because that way, at the worst, you got to keep the diamond, and at the best, you got both the diamond and the money. But if you trusted the other person, you ran the risk of losing everything, because he might betray you. It was called the sucker payoff. What the prisoner's dilemma expressed was the strange logic of the Cold War. The optimum solution, offering to get rid of all your weapons, provided the Russians did the same, could never happen, because you couldn't trust them not to cheat. So instead, you went for stability, created by a balance of dangerous weapons on both sides. And what Nash had done was to turn that into a theory of how the whole of society worked. It had enormous implications for politics, because it proved that one could...
I mean, we're a long way away. This is something Hilaire Belloc talks about in one of his books, where, you know, back in the day in England, let's say there were two local bakers, right? They would just have an agreement between themselves. They would not undercut each other. And there was no like law on the books. There was no contract. This was just an agreement that all of the bakers did, you know, between themselves. You know, I'm selling a loaf for 1 pence. You do it for 1 pence as well. And we can both stay in business, basically. That and basically that system worked for a very long time, according to Belloc, until outside merchants came to England and they were like, we're not fucking doing that, we'll undercut you, and basically drove all of the bakers then, or all of the businesses in the entirety of England, to become much more cutthroat and ruthless, because they had to be, otherwise they'd be driven out of business by this new outside group that came in. It's kind of difficult for me not to think of that when I'm looking at this now, because now we're at the opposite end, where the very notion of those two bakers not screwing each other over is seen as like being like beyond, that's not even thinkable in the Nash world, you know.
You've had a salutary lesson in this last week. I mean, I'm going to be slightly provocative here, but you've had this example with the politics of the right in the UK, where you've had this character in the Reform Party, Gawain Towler, who has made this admission during an interview about how in the old UKIP days they would shop people to hope not hate as a method of keeping their turf clean. And again, this reminds us that politics is institutionalized betrayal played at that level, and that's something which possibly has created a shock reaction in people, but really should be expected, unfortunately.
Nash all the way down. Fuck you, buddy, all the way down. Yeah. Let's carry on.
Could have a society based on individual freedom that wouldn't degenerate into chaos. But the price of that freedom would mean a world in which everyone would have to be suspicious and distrustful of their fellow human beings.
The Nash equilibrium is important because one of the great fears of politics is that self-interest would lead to utter chaos. And what the Nash equilibrium suggests is that rational pursuit of self-interest, even in the face of implacable hostile enemies, will lead to a kind of an order in which all players agree upon the strategies that they're playing and that those strategies make sense to them. But at the same time, it's also paranoid because it's the idea of a human being sitting alone in a room, being able to totally reconstruct their opponent. Their opponent is totally implacable, totally hostile, and bent on their destruction.
But there was a small problem with Nash's equations. They didn't seem to correlate with how human beings actually behave towards each other in the real world. When the Prisoner's Dilemma game was tested out on the secretaries of the RAND Corporation, none of them played the rational strategy. Instead of betraying each other, they always trusted each other and decided to cooperate. And what no one realised was that John Nash himself was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He had delusions in which he believed that those around him who wore red ties were communist spies, and that he was part of a secret organisation that could save the world.
You don't want to admit that you are crazy. You see the other people as crazy, but you like to think of yourself as not crazy, as still rational. So I thought there were some secret organizations of humans or secret beliefs among some categories of humans, and I thought I had some relation to that. I heard voices, and I ultimately realized that...
This is James Lindsay now, of course.
I didn't hear anything but something that I created in my own mind. I was talking to myself mentally.
You do have to say, like, so we've got this, we can criticize the model. I mean, I didn't even begin on the potential for scaling this up and assuming that everybody in the whole world is a rational individual, even when the core population, even when, as he said, in the real world, in real life, out on the street, and in your local villages and on all of that, this model doesn't actually match up with reality. So that's a failing. And then they're going to scale it all the way up to encompass everybody in the world, which I'll come on to later, probably, the problems with that. Well, we've already kind of spoken about it. But then on top of that, it's got like, well, the bloke's a paranoid schizophrenic. And you think, where are the safeguards here? Where is like the sort of somebody saying, hang on a minute, the bloke's a maniac and his theory isn't correct. Can we just like come up with something else? Can we put him away? And instead, they just kind of, yeah, it's great. We're just going to go full bore with it. I mean, you know, it's like they've just got a free hand.
Yeah, it is a bit strange. It's like the checks and balances that were always promised never actually kick in. But I mean, maybe there was more debate, and Curtis is just kind of skirting over it. But it does seem like they just went for it, doesn't it?
In 1959, Nash was forcibly committed to a mental hospital, and he would spend the next 10 years battling schizophrenia. But despite the obvious problems with Nash's theories, the young technocrats at Rand were convinced that in them lay the seeds of a new form of ordering society, based on the free individual. Because the equations provided a scientific basis for the alternative vision that Friedrich von Hayek had called for. But for the moment, these ideas remain confined to a few thinkers at the heart of the nuclear establishment. But Nash's ideas were about to spread in the most surprising way.
But that, Morgoth, to your point, that might be the answer. What you just mentioned is that it's kind of kept in to a very closed circle of people, a vanguard, you might say, hasn't kind of hit Normieville or even like normal politicians by this point.
1,000 miles away, there was a radical psychiatrist who had a vision. He wanted to make people free of all constraints that he believed controlled their minds without them realizing. And to make them free, like Nash, he would fundamentally question and undermine the old ideas of trust and love.
Is love possible? Is freedom possible? Is the truth possible? Is it possible to be one's actual self with another human being? Is it possible to be a human being anymore? Is it possible to be a person? Do persons even exist?
Sorry to pause it again, but Simon, that was another classic criticism, wasn't it?
1,000 miles away.
Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, there was this bloke, completely unrelated to anything we've been talking about. But I'm gonna somehow find a way to wrap it in. This is I don't know what you'd call it. It's this kind of non-linear storytelling that Curtis does.
R.D. Laing had begun work as a psychiatrist in the mental hospitals in Glasgow in the 1950s. It was a violent, frightening world in which the doctors tried to manage and control schizophrenics as best they could. Laing had noticed that the psychiatrists hardly ever spoke to the schizophrenics. So as an experiment, he took 12 women and spent months talking to them about themselves and their lives. The results were dramatic. After just a few months, all 12 were well enough to leave the hospital. Within a year, Laing discovered that all of them had returned to the hospital. His attempt at a cure had failed completely.
After this experiment, these women left hospital, and after another year they were all back again. No one knew why they'd come in the first place, and no one knew why they had to come back again. So that shifted my focus of attention and interest and research interest out into the actual circumstances where this thing called madness is incubated.
Laing began to investigate the families of the schizophrenics. His research led him into a hidden, closed world where he studied how the members of the families behaved towards each other in private. And he became convinced that the roots of this madness lay concealed in this unexamined world. The doctors and nurses who used chemicals and ECT to try and return the patients to their families were making a terrible mistake. They were sending them back to the private horror that had first created the madness. If this were true, then the doctors, although they believed that they were doing their public duty and what was best for the patient, were in reality violent agents of oppression.
I think it's very important that a doctor remember his duty to give the patient what is best for them in their long-term interest, which isn't always what the patient asks for. If you want to go home to your relatives, the relatives have got to be reasonably sure that you will fit in reasonably well in their home so that they can go on living a normal life.
In the early 60s, Laing set up a psychiatric practice in Harley Street in London. He offered radical new treatments for schizophrenia and quickly became a media celebrity. But his research into the causes of schizophrenia had convinced him that a much wider range of human problems were caused by the pressure cooker of family life. Laing decided to investigate how power and control were exercised within the world of normal families. And to do this, he would use the techniques of game theory. Laing had learnt about game theory when he visited the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto in California. A group of research scientists there were trying to use game theory as a way of analysing human interaction. And Laing saw in this the perfect tool to dissect what went on between the members of families in Britain.
Laing used game theory in his analysis of families. He was concerned with games not in the sense of fun, but games in the sense of people playing by rules, some of which were explicit and some of which they were unaware of.
I just wanted to say it kind of touches on Century of the Self again, but it's just how easily you segue from the rhetoric of Woodstock and hippies and flowers and freedom and individualism and self-expression. And it's just like with a little hop, skip, and a leap, you've got like people called Moron Schatzman in a suit who wants to test your family and they want to crawl into the house of suburbia to find out what the conversations are on the dinner table. And it's like all of a sudden, like immediately it becomes this kind of dystopian, all-encompassing technocratic authoritarianism, and not what will eventually sort of promote itself into being just outright surveillance, where it's like the dream just withers on the vine straight away with any kind of implementation. It really becomes what they've rebelled against within just a few years. And in the case of that Laing character, apparently, like almost immediately. It's like, I mean, I'll get onto that later, but what even is the norm in all of this? I despise all of this thinking and this entire industry. I hate it all. I think it's anti-human.
I'm going to flow into that again, because that's a great word that Morgoth used there about suburbia. And this is going back to the Rand Corporation in America briefly, when in 1947, there was one of their guys, a wartime psychiatrist, a guy called William Menninger. He addressed the American Psychiatric Association in New York, and essentially he was spelling out that it was vitally important to bring the benefits of psychiatry to the masses, and to quote, offer its therapeutic effect to a world full of unhappiness and maladjustment. And just reading a brief quote from Ken Hollings's book, Welcome to Mars, he says, under Menninger's kindly interest, the suburbs will gradually be transformed into suburbia, as much a state of mind as a dispersed geographic location. As such, suburbia can only give birth to itself. Its inhabitants, their expectations, and the way they intend to live their lives are merely byproducts of that process, the raw material of social engineering. In relocating from the cities, the new suburbanites have left their extended families behind, together with their traditional values and knowledge. The door is thus left wide open for the psychologists and social scientists to walk in and take a look around.
Yeah. Which in a sense was secret. He thought he'd uncovered a fresh way of looking at human relations, those secret games that people had. This was a way in which it could be subject to some sort of scientific investigation. It could be quantified. You could give people questionnaires. Oh, it was very much the application of game theory. That's exactly what it was.
Laing took 20 couples in Britain, and using a complex series of questionnaires, he analysed how each of them saw the other, moment by moment in their daily life.
I mean, this is psycho, isn't it? Let's be honest. This is fucking sick when you think about what.
Continually asking them what they secretly thought the other really intended. Following game theory, he then coded the responses and had them analysed by a computer. Out of that, Laing produced matrices which showed how, just as in the Cold War, couples used their everyday actions as strategies to control and manipulate each other. His conclusions were stark, that what were normally seen as acts of kindness and love were in reality weapons used selfishly to exert power and control.
Right. That's it for the missus. I'm going to get these. I'm going to find these. Going to game theory the fuck out of my own. Be like,
there's interesting stuff here because, I mean, about 30 years ago, I was very influenced by a book I picked up by a psychiatrist called Robin Skinner, who wrote a book with John Cleese. And it was the outcome of when John Cleese went through therapy in the sort of early 70s. And it was called Families and How to Survive Them. And Robin Skinner, in a sense, he developed something called family systems therapy. It's kind of like a soft sort of context that Laing was taking further. And basically, it's the idea that families orientate usually around a sort of a shared psychological blind spot or a problem. You know, some families have a problem with the emotion of anger or something like that, and they'll find ways to negotiate around that problem emotion. You know, there might not be conscious behaviors, but they'll sort of work out a way to deal with it. It takes a lot of its cue from Tolstoy's quote in Anna Karenina about happy families are all alike, but even every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And so there was a sort of context, especially in the 70s, of people embracing this kind of, you know, dynamic therapy, which looked at, you know, how to treat not just individuals like Freudian long form analysis on a couch, but actually treat people collectively and look at the dynamics of the way they were working. And obviously Laing was taking it in a very, you know, it was a very jaundiced view of humanity in a particularly, you know, extreme direction.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that makes me skeptical of all of this, of course, is that in my experience, women have no like mental tally of quid pro quo or anything like that. Like any bloke who's been in a relationship knows, like, it doesn't matter. Like, let's say you've been a great guy and you've done all of the things you're meant to do for the past like 6 months, say. But that day she's in a bad mood and you've done something to piss her off. None of the accumulated kind of goodwill counts for anything in that moment. It won't count for shit, basically, because women don't think like that. They don't keep a tally system in that way. And so I'm kind of interested to know how this works between men and women, because in my experience, there is no it's not a kind of rational thing with women. It's often just how they're feeling in the moment, and the things they'll say in the moment also aren't ever anything they mean, if that makes any sense. Like, the actual content of their words means nothing in the overall scheme of things, because I don't know, let's just take it to the extreme. I hate you and I would never want to see you again.
Yeah.
And 2 hours later you're cuddling up watching a film, you know, or whatever. I mean, everybody in a relationship would have had some sort of experience of that, because this is what women are like. So I'm kind of interested to know how all of this works between the extreme differences between the genders, because
it's funny. It's funny you should say that, because in me notes for this section here is actually something relating to that. And I was watching this again yesterday. I just watched it a couple of weeks back as well. And I was thinking, what is the opposite of this? Because I hate this. I hate everything about this idea that we look, because I'm very much an organic, you know, kind of Spengler type of guy. What would be the opposite of this? And I was reminded of a month or two back when, with the missus, we watched the David Lean movie Ryan's Daughter, and in that, obviously you've got the passions and you've got things with women, and in it you've got this small rural Irish community, and a kind of wayward, free-spirited woman called Rose, that's played by Sarah Miles, and you've got what is he called? The priest is Trevor Howard. And what I was thinking about was that, you know, a lot of the issues that they're talking about here, they would go to the priest. But the priest, because he lives within the village and he drinks stout with the local men, it's set during World War One, that he's much more in tune with the villagers as people and not as numbers on a spreadsheet. And so he knows, for example, that Rose is a bit wayward and a bit wild, and he also understands that when this handsome Englishman arrives from the front, he's been wounded, they bring him into the little village where he can kind of take things easy for a bit, and he's limping around, but he's a bit charred, he's a bit moody, and the priest recognizes immediately there's trouble here, because if those two get together, there's going to be trouble, and he foresees it all. But it's because he's got this like personal attachment, and he kind of picks up on all of these little interactions and just the personalities of the people where he is. And what's happened here is that everything is kind of put through a computer. All of those little interactions and all of those emotions are abstracted away from actually living and actually being human, and instead like literally reduced to ciphers on a spreadsheet, and then extrapolated and put out as a model for the entire population. And I find it kind of sick and depressing. But there's also, like, if you've got which is kind of what Simon was talking about with suburbia, if you've got these societies of scale, how do you actually do this? How do you actually confront these problems? I would say leave people alone by and large, and definitely don't manipulate them. But the fact is, if you think of like these giant suburban estates, which is what they're kind of nudging at here, especially when we go to America, then the fact is you just can't have like Trevor Howard as the worldly priest who was in touch with everybody's emotions. And so a lot of this is kind of using numbers and computer data models to get to grips with a society of such mass and scale. It's as if we've doomed ourselves by living in such a way where you're on 5 square miles of suburban housing estate, that you, in a way, cease to be like a real human.
Mm-hmm. It's I'm going to sort of mount a bit of a defense of Laing here, because he's a really difficult figure to get to grips with. The assumptions that he's talking about here seem incredibly bleak, and when you look at his background, he had a pretty bleak kind of childhood. He was born in Glasgow in the late 20s, and he wasn't kind of let out to associate with other children until he was kind of into his teenage years. And there's a couple of sort of really strange anecdotes about, I mean, I think his mother was probably mentally ill, and I mean, maybe even his father as well. There was a couple of anecdotes that he tells in some of the interviews, that his father only ever gave his mother a birthday present once. And he describes the sort of lead up to his father giving his mother this little, tiny box that was beautifully wrapped and, cotton wool, and his mother unwrapped it. And what his father had given his mother was a box of his own toenail clippings. And later he talked about Laing. He talked about one of his own daughters who, as an adult, had been talking to his mother. And his mother used to keep a little small figurine with her. And the daughter said she told Laing, she keeps this figurine and she calls it Ronnie. And she sticks pins into its heart. And it's a slightly, obviously it's pretty odd. But it's interesting to note, when Laing died, he died in 1989 of a heart attack. So there's a spooky element there. But, the way Laing tried to address people with his therapy was that he'd been horrified by working in the conventional psychiatric form in the 50s, where the treatment was generally, he'd been an army psychiatrist, and he'd had to deal with people who were trying to get out of the army by pretending to be crazy, by pretending to be schizophrenic. And the mode of treatment then was the same as with John Nash, who we saw earlier. They would take people into institutions and they would give them what they call insulin shock therapy. They would basically put them into forced insulin comas. And these comas would be like an hour a day, 6 days a week, for something like 6 months. and these things, they would induce convulsions, but essentially they would suppress people who were sort of, psychotic, out of touch with reality. But it would suppress them to such an extent they became very pliable and very passive. But at the worst end, they ended up being brain damaged or even dying. So Laing was kind of horrified by this, and he tried to address and take people who were, quote, mentally ill, delusional, psychotic, schizophrenic. And although he found there was a use for medications and treatments and things like ECT, he primarily steered away from that and just tried to be with people. Just he would talk to them. A bit like what Morgoth's saying about the priest character. He would just. He didn't see mental illness as something that had to be medicalized in that way. And you can see sort of clips of him sort of, as it were, doing therapy with people online. And he just, is dealing with people in a normal way. He'll say, let's go for a walk and just talk, with people who are sort of, we would consider out of their mind. But that was the sort of approach he took. So, as I say, he's difficult to get to grips with. He had his own problems. A lot of the interviews later in his life, he's probably drunk, but he I think there was a sort of a genuinely compassionate side to him, but it was informed, and he acknowledged it was informed by this very difficult sort of childhood upbringing.
I think it's interesting as well, just on to finish off me point on the priest does set hard boundaries, but he does so in a way where he's saying, look, to Rose, I understand that you're bored in this little one donkey town on the west coast of Ireland. I understand that you're too intelligent for the yokels. I understand that you're frustrated, but you cannot have an affair with that man. You just can't. That's it. It's not right, and all hell will break loose if you do. And so it's kind of like, on the one hand, it's saying, yes, I understand all of your I understand your psychology better than you do, but you do not have infinite liberty to just do whatever the hell you want because of the greater good, which is kind of different to what they're saying here, because through this kind of technocratic model, they would say, yeah, just get a divorce and do whatever you want because individual liberty comes first.
Yeah.
Laing really did feel that the family was an arena for strategizing. Love was a way in which one person tried to dominate another person. I love you, but I'm making a condition for that love which is impossible for you to fulfill. And so there's nothing you can do to earn my love, even though I'm telling you, you have to earn my love.
From this research, Laing argued that the modern family, far from being a caring, nurturing institution, was in reality a dark arena where people played continuous selfish games with each other. Out of this struggle came stability in society, but a bleak and limited existence for all the individuals involved.
Just got an image of me asking the missus, I'll have a cuppa please, or whatever. Somebody in the corner being like, dark interaction, secret power plays going on in the Parveen household, or whatever. It's just like,
yeah.
The so-called normal families that I studied in the course of this work, it was like walking into...
I'll just mention I usually do it myself because my missus is one of those ones who only drinks coffee, which means she makes a bad cuppa. Doesn't let the tea bag sit for long enough, so it usually ends up being too weak or too much milk or whatever. So
it's all these things are mundane as well. Like in my household with my missus, it's like I do the dishes and she does the cooking. And then that meme where it's Ben Stiller and that blonde fella at the glitzy, what's that called? That fashion thing, and they give us
Zoolander.
Yeah, and they give each other the eyes as they walk past each other. And then sometimes it'll be like, well, what if we get a takeaway? And then both are we're looking at each other. Well, who benefits from a takeaway? She doesn't have to cook, and I don't have to do the dishes. But is there an angle in that? You know what I mean? And it's like that meme where they're looking at each other. But at the end of the day, it's just completely like unimportant and mundane. Like it just doesn't matter.
This is what Laing was on about. He took an idea that was called double bind, where, imagine a relationship where a woman's with a man and she suspects that the man, she probably thinks or knows the man no longer loves her, but the man, says back to her, I absolutely love you and you absolutely can't leave me, because it would absolutely destroy me. And then the woman takes on the sort of the guilt from that, in order to keep this dysfunctional relationship going. So it's this sort of mutual exploitation of people by this getting locked in to this pattern of codependency, and that was a sort of key thing that Laing worked around.
Carbon monoxide gas chambers. People induce their children to adjust to life by poisoning themselves to a level of subsistence existence that they called life.
Laing was radicalized by his findings. He believed that the struggle for power and control that he had uncovered in the family was inextricably linked with the struggle for power and control in the world. In a violent and corrupt society, the family had become a machine for controlling people. Laing believed that this was an objective reality revealed by his scientific methods, above all by game theory. But these very methods contained within them bleak, paranoid assumptions about what human beings were really like.
I mean, he'd have a field day with my new bedtime regime for AAA, wouldn't he? Because I'm like, listen, head on the pillow, feet down the bottom, no talking, and if you break those rules, Elsa is going in the bin. So how's it going to be? He'd be like, oh, dark power plays. But look, you try getting AAA to bed, RD Laing, all right?
I mean, there's a funny, there was a cartoonist called Giles in the 70s. People may have seen. There's sort of books of his work that are around. He used to do cartoons for the Daily Express. And I always remember there's a famous cartoon he did of a scene in a prison cell where some, horrible spotty scrote is with his lawyer, and the lawyer's running through the particulars of his case with him, and the lawyer is saying to the guy, he says, you say it all stems from your unhappy childhood. Your mummy wouldn't let you have a teddy bear, so at precisely 1 minute after kick-off you decided to boot a policeman in the face. And it's that sort of moment where people start to sort of take this conditioned view of things like violence or aggression, and move away from personal agency towards the mindset of, it's society in it.
Let me just say something. I can see people freaking out about my bedtime methods in the chat here. Look, it took me 2 days using that method to get it in bed by 7:30 every single night. After a week, it was 7:30 every single night for 7 days straight. Now it's pretty much been for a month straight. I've been ill for the past 3 days. Past 3 days, I've been banished to the lodge because I'm not well. Checking in. What time did she go to bed last night? Oh, it was late, 8:30, 9 o'clock last night. So 3 days, I'm not there, already slipping. Why? Because of that same namby-pamby attitude I see in the chat there, not enforcing the law.
This is it.
So this is, when you become a dad, you come to realize man's role is to enforce. You have to enforce the
kids
actual
can't self-regulate. Yeah,
because if you don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. So there you go. And look, it gave us the entire revamp era as well. So can't complain.
Assumptions born out of the hostility of the Cold War. And what Laing was actually doing was helping spread these bleak, paranoid ideas into other areas of society, into the very way we thought about ourselves and our relationships to each other.
It gave a message of, I have seen things that you can hardly imagine. A bleak, cold landscape out there that I'm going to do my best to armor you against. And we will walk into there together and we will protect each other back out there in this cold, bleak landscape. But don't you ever bullshit yourself that it's anything more or better than that, because that's where it is.
Laing wrote a series of books, with titles like The Politics of Experience that became huge bestsellers, and he became one of the leaders of the new counterculture movement.
I'm telling you!
The aim of the movement was to make people realise that none of the state institutions of the post-war world could be trusted. Those that claimed to be motivated by public duty and a desire to help were really part of the system that was trying to control your mind and destroy your freedom.
Their whole mind is, like a cabbage. They're suppressed. They can't do exactly what they want. They haven't got any freedom. They haven't got any freedom to do exactly what they want under the system.
One had to be constantly on guard, never trusting anyone, even those who said they loved you.
A lot of people are caught in the trap that they feel that they ought to trust or believe the person they love because they love them. But I don't see that follows at all.
What Laing and the counterculture movement were doing was tearing down Britain's institutions in the name of freedom. And they were about to find the most unexpected allies. They would be joined by a group of economists from the political right who had exactly the same aim and who would become immensely powerful. This group were all inspired by the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, and most of them had also worked at the Rand Corporation. And they brought with them the sophisticated mathematical techniques like game theory. They would use these techniques to prove scientifically that the idea of public duty, which had underpinned British public life for generations, was a sham and a corrupt hypocrisy. Their ideas would begin to demolish.
I just on a sort of film-making point, I love what he's done here, that kind of ethereal, heavenly tune, which I had to look up, and it's from the movie The Starman. And it's got this sort of... He's actually talking about something quite sinister, depending on how you would look at it. But there's a kind of sarcasm implied where it's like, now these heavenly angels of the free market have arrived to take on board these ideas and allow everybody to buy council houses, and everybody's going to get on with Hayekian economics. And he's kind of put it to the backdrop of this heavenly angels. It reminds me of a bit in one of the Clint Eastwood westerns when he's sitting on the horse and the ugly is about to be hanged or hung, and then Lee Van Cleef says, well, even scum like him has a heavenly angel somewhere, and you get a kind of similar music where it's Clint Eastwood sitting on his horse waiting to shoot him down, and it's this kind of funny, clever sarcasm where it's not really heavenly at all, is it? It doesn't really warrant this kind of music at all, does it, Adam?
Yeah, he uses this technique a lot. I think they call it contrapuntal sound or juxtaposition or something, but he does it a lot. This has actually been one of the first things that he did, because I think he even does it in Oceans Apart right at the start of his career. So this has been one of the touchstone Curtis techniques to use this kind of audio cue that is not quite what it doesn't quite match up to what he's saying. So it's kind of interesting. Go on, Simon. Sorry.
No. So I was just going to compliment what you're both saying. Essentially, this is that moment in history where it's the idea that the man with the slide rule is going to turn up and everything's going to be better. That moment of scientific rationalism,
enlightenment,
and
transcendence has arrived.
Yeah. These are the operant assumptions now.
The old institutions of the British state. They would also introduce the paranoid assumptions of the Cold War ever further into the heart of British society.
Just literally a man sitting in a tube there with a ruler behind his head on the poster. I don't know if you've noticed that little
very good
curious.
In the early 70s, the government bureaucracies in Britain began to collapse. Those who ran them blamed a growing economic crisis, but it was clear that something much more fundamental had gone wrong. What were supposed to be institutions to help people had become destructive. Those who ran them seemed to have turned against the very people they were supposed to serve.
financial restrictions.
Well, can you get him for a minute? Well, it's urgent, this.
I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to disclose that.
We don't deal with that sort of thing.
Not available.
A group of right-wing economists in America now put forward a theory that they said explained why this was happening. At the heart of their idea was game theory. They said that the fundamental reality of life in society was one of millions of people continually watching and strategizing against each other, all seeking only their own advantage. An assumption had become a truth. The self-interested model of human behaviour that had been developed in the Cold War to make the mathematical equations work had now been adopted by these economists as a fundamental truth about the reality of all human social interaction.
We're always trying to infer the intentions of the other. We're always trying to convey our intentions, either deceptively or truthfully. We're always trying to find ways to make believable promises, and sometimes to make believable threats, threatening the Soviet Union, threatening a misbehaving animal, threatening a child, threatening a neighbor. I think what we're doing is what we call strategizing. What does he think that I think he thinks that I think he's going to do? It has to come to some kind of equilibrium. What is it that we can both recognize is the obvious thing to do?
What this meant,
just quick trivia on that guy. He's Thomas Schelling. He got a Nobel Memorial Prize for his work on game theory. He invented the phrase collateral damage. And he was another of those characters, actually, that Stanley Kubrick talked to when he made Dr. Strangelove.
Economists argued was that the politicians and the bureaucrats' belief that they were working for what they called the public good was a complete fantasy. Because
there's our first fantasy. Yeah. I should mention that, if you ever go to the IEA, which I have been wont to do on occasion, when you walk in, on the wall, there's a massive portrait of F.A. Hayek on one wall, and on opposite wall is a massive portrait of James Buchanan, face to face like that. And then they've got a couple of others like that, and it's like a corridor of these figures that Curtis is talking about. Kind of interesting thing to think about in the context of this whole documentary, but yeah, it's still there now in 2024. So
to do that depended on creating shared goals in society based on self-sacrifice and altruism. But in a world that was really driven by millions of suspicious, self-seeking individuals, such concepts could not exist. Out of this came a theory called public choice, and a group of economists who were determined to destroy the politicians' dream that they were working for the public interest. Their leader was called James Buchanan.
There's certainly no measurable concept that's meaningful that could be called the public interest, because how do you weigh different interests of different groups and what they can get out of it? The public interest, as a politician thinks it, does not mean it exists. It's what he thinks is good for the country. If he would come out and say that, that's one thing. But behind this hypocrisy of calling something the public interest as if it exists, that's what I was trying to tear down.
In 1975, Mrs. Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, and Buchanan's ideas had a powerful influence on her and the group of radicals gathered around her. A right-wing think tank advising Mrs. Thatcher brought James Buchanan to London for a series of seminars. And he explained starkly why the British state was failing. It was pure game theory. Because there was no agreed version of the public good, the bureaucrats and the politicians schemed and strategized in their own self-interest, building up their power and their own empires. They claimed to be helping others. In fact, it was the very opposite, and the result was economic chaos and a breakdown of society.
It was chaos. There is no other word for it. And then public choice theory came along and told us why. It's because the self-interest of the groups that have managed to acquire control of the process is such that they're directing these activities to their own advantage at the expense of the rest of society. When public servants and politicians say they're pursuing the public interest, the words are those of public service, the actions are those of self-interest, maximising personal advantage.
Now,
I find this a little bit, if you go back to the era, were people like Arthur Scargill or Tony Benn, is it? And these they strike me as being men of conviction. I mean, you may not like their lefty politics. You could say maybe somebody like Nick Griffin. But the point that I'm getting at is that there were politicians of conviction. There were politicians who believed in something, and they were always marginalized and kicked out.
I think the Buchanan answer to all of these things, though, would be like, let's pretend that Tony Benn had absolute control over what happened in Britain. And I mean, at different times, he did have ministerial posts, didn't he, Ben, under Callaghan and so on, right? He would just argue his vision of what the public wants is actually just an imposition of his his moral conviction. It is not actually what the public wants. What the public actually wants is, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, burgers, and all of the other gifts that the free market brings.
What he was saying is that once these people get into these positions, all they do is look to shore up their own personal gain, to grift, basically. But is really?
Yeah.
Because the people have voted for Tony Benn. If he wants to be an out socialist, he was against the European Union, I think. So he had these ideas, and to say, well, it doesn't matter because once he gets in office, he's just going to be a self-centered con man. He's just going to try and get, he's going to loot the expenses. He's going to try and shore up his position. I don't buy it. I don't. Even though, and I mean, I'm a pretty cynical fella. But I do think that it has been politicians come and go that have had even Jeremy Corbyn, you could say. Jeremy Corbyn was completely destroyed. He could have went along with the machine. And so this kind of idea, well, they're all just cynical. They're all just in it for themselves. It seems to me that the ones who are actually idealists just get purged or left on the bench. And so what you're left with actually is what he's describing. What you're left with is the con men and the grifters and the ones out for themselves. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Like the modern Tory party say, where every single person to a man is a cynical, like this Robert Gendricks, for example, has gone from being a kind of centrist Cameronite to being like a hardcore anti-immigrationist in the space of like 6 months.
Yeah.
How did this transformation happen? Was Robert Gendrick red-pilled, or is he just an opportunistic snake trying to resurrect T1000? We know the answer, basically. So.
And I think that he doesn't care one way or the other about immigration, but he sees himself sitting in a better office with more money and more power at his fingertips, not to do those policies, but just for the sake of having that position. Whereas if somebody like Jeremy Corbyn holds on to his convictions when he's just mangled through the machine, and he's called an anti-Semite, he's called all these terrible things, and he holds on. He's still today, he'll be tweeting out about whatever's going on in the Middle East. So whether or not you agree with him, it doesn't really matter. The point is that there is people there who believe in things. But it's quite sad that in order to find such people, you've got to go to the left. I mean, I couldn't name a single Tory party member. Just forget it.
Yeah, and of course the conviction politician in the Tory party who spoke up in this era, or a little bit before this era, was kicked out of the party, of course.
Yeah.
That was Enoch Powell. So
yeah.
This is certainly not true because, contrary to popular belief, both myself and my staff here, we take a very, very great personal interest in individual people.
I think you're scared. I think because there won't be so much opposition, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing or not.
please.
If you
Let
don't
me
want
answer.
me to answer, I'll go home. It's a lovely evening. I don't need to be here. But if you do want me to answer, I will stay.
Please, will you give the...
As the British economy spiralled out of control, the political and bureaucratic elite who had dominated Britain since the war found themselves under attack from both the right and the left.
There's a guy in the chat saying Corbyn isn't destroyed, he's still lingering around. I mean, okay, he's gone from being the leader of the Labour Party to being kicked out of the Labour Party. I mean, if that's not destruction, I don't know. That's like saying Enoch Powell was not destroyed because he was sitting in as an Ulster Unionist or whatever, you know, years after 1968. But the fact of the matter is that he could have been the Prime Minister and he was destroyed. And Jeremy Corbyn, nobody's talking about him becoming the Prime Minister anymore, you know, so.
Where once they had been heroic figures who would create a new world, now they were accused of being agents of control, not freedom.
We've been ruled by men who live by illusions. The illusion that you can have freedom by government decree. And I don't give that.
And these new theories began to spread into the public imagination. A writer who was part of the group advising Mrs. Thatcher began to write a sitcom that explicitly put forward the theories of public choice. As well as being funny, it was ideological propaganda for a political movement.
Humphrey, we have got to slim down the civil service.
Do you know, I'm loving this because I used to present a show with a chap called The Britisher, whose entire view of politics was taken from Yes Minister. Adam Curtis is saying that Yes Minister was secretly pushing a public choice theory and James Buchanan's ideas around the back door. But I know if I sat down with a Britisher and said, here's a book by James Buchanan, he would reject it, even though it is basically the same idea. So,
it's funny because Yes Minister, the mechanism in it, I always relate to. It works a similar way to like Fawlty Towers or Steptoe and Son. Steptoe and Son is a good example that, you know, the premise of Steptoe and Son is, you know, the younger lives with his father and he's always trying to escape the grim situation he's in. And the father sort of always finds a way to kind of trap him in that situation. And that's kind of the payoff of Yes Minister episodes, is that the principal, Jim Hacker, is, you know, as Morgan says, he's trying to do the right thing. And this is kind of celebrating a system where he always ends up effectively being suppressed by the system as well. So it's a similar sense of futility and desperation. You know, you want this sort of character to succeed in some way. He very rarely does.
That is also all British sitcoms, by the way.
Yeah, the tragedy of
the situation traps you and you're never allowed to escape. Whether
Only
you're
fools and
whether you're Rodney Trotter or Tim from The Office, you know, or whoever it is, Faulty, they're all just trapped by the situation.
And you're supposed
all
to
Harold Steptoe. It's so fucking tragic.
and you're supposed to just give a wry smile and say, "No, let's have a cup of tea. Mustn't grumble."
Whereas in American sitcoms, I've talked about this before, the characters change and develop and have like different romantic partners and they change houses and things like that because it's a much more aspirational society. Whereas the British just kind of love the everybody just being trapped by your whatever it is, class, situation, circumstances, you know. That's why Ian Beale is still like on the verge of committing suicide 20 years later on EastEnders.
How many people have we got in this department? 2,000? 3,000?
About 23,000, I think, Minister.
23,000? In the Department for Administrative Affairs? 23,000 people just administering other administrators? We'll have to do a time and motion study, see who we can get rid of.
We did one of those last year, Minister.
And?
It transpired we needed another 500 people.
The fallacy that public choice economics took on was the fallacy that government is working entirely for the benefit of the citizen. And this was reflected by showing that in the programme, in Yes Minister, we showed that almost everything that the government has to decide is a conflict between two lots of private interest, that of the politicians and that of the civil servants, trying to advance their own careers and improve their own lives. And that's why public choice economics, which explains why all this was going on, was at the root of almost every episode of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister.
At the same time, R.D. Laing was continuing his assault on what he saw as the corrupt elites. He was about to use his growing power to attack one of the most powerful professions in America, the medical and psychiatric establishment.
Is it just me, or does R.D. Laing have the same physiognomy as David Icke? They kind of look like they could be brothers or something to me.
That theme tune there, I have to say it, like in age myself, is that I think it's from a Carter film.
It's Assault on Precinct 13, John Carpenter. Yeah, the
Yeah,
original.
And there was a video game came out on the Commodore Amiga in the early 90s called Xenon 2, and somehow they got the rights to use that tune. And it was just one of those ones, I love the shooters, where you just went up the screen and you got heavier weapons and you just blasted everything to hell. And they did that as well. And it always reminds me of just this, it was an upward scroller as well. And you had like, you would get the little gem and there'd be rockets came out from the side of it. And you had that tune on, and there was just like waves after waves of like aliens to blow away. And I just miss the simplicity of those days.
I've just got a vision of Adam Curtis's CD collection is just like John Carpenter soundtracks and the collected works of Brian Eno. That's all he's got, you know.
Great bit of new order. He used
a bit of new order.
There was a bit of obscure New Order in there before as well.
The occasional 50s jazz tune, you know.
The results would be dramatic, but the outcome would be very different from what Laing intended. His ideas would undermine the all-controlling medical elite. But far from liberating people, what would actually emerge would be a revolutionary new system of order and control, driven by the objective power of numbers.
It's a space where you can meet with her, where she's not going to be frightened that you're going to put her away or that you're going to do anything to her.
Laing was now a celebrity in America and was one of the leaders of what was called the anti-psychiatry movement. Psychiatry, Laing said, was a fake science, used as a system of political control to shore up a violent, collapsing society. Its categories of madness and sanity had no reality. Madness was simply a convenient label used to lock away those who wanted to break free. Hundreds of young psychiatrists came to Laing's talks, and one of them was inspired and decided to find a way of testing whether what Laing said was true or not. Could psychiatrists in America distinguish between madness and sanity? He was called David Rosenhan, and he devised a dramatic experiment. He assembled 8 people, including himself, none of whom had ever had any psychiatric problems. Each person was then sent across the country to a specific mental hospital. At an agreed time, they all presented themselves at their hospital and told the psychiatrist on duty they were hearing a voice in their head that said the word thud. That was the only lie they should tell. Otherwise, they were to behave and respond completely normally. And then what happened?
They were all diagnosed as insane and admitted to the hospital.
All of them?
All of them.
And were any of them insane?
No. There was nobody who could have judged these people as insane. But I told friends, I told my family, I get out when I can get out. That's all. Be there for a couple of days and then I get out. Nobody knew I'd be there for 2 months.
Once admitted, all 8 fake patients acted completely normally, yet the hospitals refused to release them, and diagnosed 7 as suffering from schizophrenia, and 1 from bipolar disorder.
Isn't this literally just One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest?
Mm-hmm.
Is this what the plot of One Flew was taken from, or is it unrelated? Any idea?
I don't know if it's directly connected, but I think it was certainly a current that was available at the time. I mean, the anti-psychiatry movement. I mean, this is one of the sort of cruxes of the difficulty you have with this. stuff is that as Morgoth was saying earlier, you can sort of hate and despise this weaponization of the science of psychiatry, and how it actually it breaks people in their sort of their collective dispensation, their way they coexist. And there was this pushback, and Laing was part of this. When he went to America, apparently he said he worked out from taking readings that the average time to diagnose someone as mentally ill in America was about 3 minutes with a doctor. And so there was this sense of these things were being used to just deal with difficult people, just lock them away. And it's stark here, but I mean it was stark in the Soviet Union as well. When I talked about the insulin therapy earlier, the insulin comas. I mean, in the Soviet Union, they would just inject you with sulfur, and it wasn't so much therapeutic; it was just to punish you, because they just mixed sulfur with olive oil, and it's called sulfazine, and put it into your muscles, and it was just agonizing. So that calmed you down.
That is great.
They were all given powerful psychotropic drugs. They found there was nothing they could do to convince the doctors they were sane, and it quickly became clear that the only way out would be to agree that they were insane and then pretend to be getting better.
The only way out was to point out that they're correct.
What? This is pretty much the plot of Catch-22 as well. The writer Joseph Heller has a similar background to the man talking, and lots of other people in this, where basically if you want to get out of flying an aeroplane and doing bombing raids over Italy towards the end of World War II, what they were doing was they were saying, I'm insane, I can't fly the plane. But then there was a catch where it would say, well, only insane people would volunteer to do this in the first place, so you don't get out of doing it. And the whole book is like that. You don't hear that much about Catch-22. It's kind of fell out of the zeitgeist for some reason. But the whole, it isn't just the premise of the bombing the air raids. It's like everything about how they live, all these like weird paradoxes. I actually find it a profoundly nihilistic book as well, which, since I've learned certain things about groups and how they behave, you go back and you read Catch-22 now, and it's really quite jaw-dropping. Just how it's like an acid going through patriotism, but it's also quite a difficult book to refute. But anyway, I just wanted to say it's a similar setup to what they have in Catch-22, where in order to plead, get out of the situation, you have to plead insanity. But then if you plead insanity, you only say, and it kind of goes on and on like that.
That's all persisted through the 70s as well, because it got sort of popularized in MASH as well, didn't it? You had the character of Klinger who was always dressing as a woman to try and get out of the army. So it was a kind of recurrent theme of this sense of being trapped, and your best excuse is not going to get you out of this system.
Catch-22 is one of those things that has entered the idiom as a saying. People talk about a Catch-22 situation, but they've forgotten the reference point. I can't remember what the name for that is, but it's
I've been busy writing a long essay for on and off for months, which I've just called On Pessimism, which is kind of dealing with the fact that people tend to say that I'm a pessimist and miserable a lot. And I don't exactly know how to wind it up, but in it I reference Catch-22 quite a bit, because I'm trying to distinguish between being a pessimist and being a nihilist. And in Catch-22, there's a scene where I believe they go into either Bologna or Rome, and you've got an idealistic young American soldier, and he has an interaction with this like 110-year-old Italian who's sitting there, who's a proper pervert. He's surrounded by young teenage girls and whatnot, and they have a conversation, and the American says, why are your people running like cowards? And the old man, what I've learned since is that this is actually just Joseph Heller. Joseph Heller is the old man, I think. Ostensibly it's the old Italian man says, because they're smart, it's you that's stupid. And then the American soldier says, what do you mean stupid? We've invaded you and conquered you, and then we're going to go on and invade and conquer Germany. And then the old man says, and then America itself will fall away and decay. Only the cowards and the rodents will survive, and America will come down. And the young man says, but like America is the most mightiest country on the world, and we're just going to get even more powerful. And then the old man says, you've been around for 200 years. Will you live? The frog has been around for 4 million years. Will America survive as long as the frog? Will America be here in 4 million years? Because cowards like me will be. And it's this, I found that it's clever in this kind of deconstructive, kind of nihilist way. But I've learned that it is a specific kind of thinking which I don't like and which I think is quite alien, because it is a complete refutation of the kind of points that somebody like Evola would make, or what would be considered traditional European views on heroism, or you know, it is the morality of a kind of the persecuted slave as the ultimate victor in history, and it's kind of put across in Catch-22 as being this super intelligent, like this lecherous old Italian who actually is an insert for something else, I believe, is going to tear all of your ideals down and mock them like that. And when I read it when I was first a young man, when I was backpacking, I thought that was so clever. But now I'm like, nah, I don't like that whatsoever. I don't like that. So I've had reason to go back to Catch-22 for something I was working on.
It's like the final victory of Falstaff, Simon, over the old chivalric values.
Yeah.
In Shakespeare, the cynical, cowardly character Falstaff is seen as a figure of fun, as something to be mocked, as something to be despised and rejected. And it's funny how, you know, fast forward 500 years and that's being seen as the smart position, and the chivalric hero would be the one who would be mocked for, you know, having honor, or, you know, because, you know, coming back to the Nash equation, you know, well, if you have any honor, you're stupid, basically, because you're going to lose in this system. You know, is the ultimate point. But anyway.
Yeah.
They had said I was insane. I am insane, but I'm getting better. That was an affirmation of their view of me.
When Rosenhan finally got out and reported the experiment, there was an uproar. He was accused of trickery and deceit. And one major hospital challenged him to send some more fakes to them, guaranteeing that they would spot them this time. Rosenhan agreed. And after a month, the hospital proudly announced that they had discovered 41 fakes. Rosenhan then revealed he had sent no one to the hospital. The effect of the third experiment was a disaster for American psychiatry. It destroyed the idea that they were a privileged elite with specialist knowledge. But those in charge realized that psychiatry could not just give up. Another way had to be found of understanding and managing people's inner feelings in modern society. And like R.D. Laing, they turned to the objective purity of mathematical analysis. They set out to create a scientific system of diagnosing people's inner mental states, in which all human judgment would be removed and replaced instead by a system based on the power of numbers. They gave up on the idea that they could understand the human mind and cure it. Instead, American psychiatry created a new set of measurable categories that were only based on the surface behavior of human beings. Many were given new names, like attention deficit disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder.
Psychiatry says we don't know the causes for any of these conditions, and then just said, this is what they look like. This is what depression looks like. This is what ADHD looks like. This is what PTSD looks like. This is what multiple personality looks like. Whether they exist in any particular way, or they exist in the same way, or if they are the same kinds of things, didn't matter. This is just what they look like.
What mattered was that these disorders could be observed and thus recorded. The psychiatrists created a system in which the diagnosis could literally be done by computer. The observable characteristics of each of the disorders were listed precisely, and questionnaires were then designed that asked people whether they had those characteristics. The answers were simply yes and no, so they could be asked by lay interviewers, not by psychiatrists. The computer would then decide whether people were normal or abnormal.
The lay interviewer asks specific questions and notes them. That person is not making the diagnosis. That data is fed into a computer. The computer program then looks at the pattern and makes the diagnosis. So the diagnosis was made by the computer. There was no clinical judgment required.
The psychiatrists then decided to test this system, and at the end of the 1970s they sent interviewers out across America with the questionnaires. Hundreds of thousands of people selected at random were interviewed. Up to this point, psychiatrists had only dealt with individuals who felt they needed help. This was the first time that anyone had gone out and asked ordinary people how they thought and felt, and the results, when processed by the computers, were astonishing. More than 50% of Americans suffered from some type of mental disorder.
These studies revealed very high rates of mental disorder. There are very, very high rates of disorders out there. Half the population has a mental disorder at some point. 17% of the population has a depressive episode at some point. Figures like that. These rates astonish people. They're enormous rates. And the general conclusion was there is a hidden epidemic.
More surveys were done, and yet again the computers returned the same disturbing data. The surveys showed that underneath the surface of normal life, millions of people who never before would have been thought of as mentally ill were secretly living with high levels of mental anxiety. The psychiatrists began screening programs across the country. And for many people, the checklists were a liberation. Their private suffering was finally being recognized.
I actually heard on the radio they were having a national anxiety screening day.
I should mention when it comes to all of this is that I have my own rather idiosyncratic theories about all of this. What's that book called, Simon? That book that codifies all of this?
DSM, the DSM manual.
The DSM, yeah.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Started in 1952. The total number of disorders that were listed then was 106. The last edition was 2013, and the number of disorders has grown to 312.
But my theory is that once upon a time, most of these people who were diagnosed would not have had an issue because our entire society is front-loaded on cognitive function now, right? Whereby basically you have to have a degree to do many, many different types of jobs. Whereas once upon a time, these people would have either been in the army, or they would have been like doing menial labor, or they would have been, they wouldn't have had to be forced into a situation where, they have to think all the time, right? And the anxiety that people feel basically also comes from the uncertainty of being in a society that doesn't have fixed roles. So once upon a time, right? Well, my father was a coal miner. His father was a coal miner. His father before him was a coal miner. I'm going to be a coal miner too, because that's who we are, right? And there's a security in that. Well, you take all of that away, and that in itself is anxiety-inducing as well. Then on top of that, you say, well, the only way to get ahead here is to do well at school, and then go to university, and then go and work in the city. Like all of this is anxiety, quote unquote, anxiety inducing, right? And so what I'm saying is, if you look at what the DSM posits as the median normal man, right, as the person who is neurotypical, quote unquote, what do you end up with? I mean, you'll basically end up with, I don't know, like a HR drone. I don't know, like somebody who is like the dead median of this society that we're like nobody fulfills that criteria. We're all atypical, So go on, Morgan. Sorry.
I mean, one of the first ever videos that I did, it was one of my early fishing videos, and somebody that I'd known, that I was working with, had killed himself. I realized that I've actually known 5 or 6 people who've killed themselves at that point. There's been another few since. And I did a video, and I kind of, it was when I began thinking about this, because what I was getting at was that actually it's societal problems, because what's assumed is that these people had actually been to psychiatrists and whatnot, and they were told that it was them that was the problem. So it's the problem is at the individual level, and none of the things which we were giving, you pump them full of pills, or the things that they were being told. None of them really seem to work. And I kind of got the impression, well, what if society is actually the problem and not the individual? What if it's society that's driving people mad? And the problem that you run into is that, well, in order to fix that would require radical solutions and a complete overhaul of everything about how we live. And so they don't even factor that in. What they do is say, well, it's a you problem. You get to this, well, I mean, you get the kind of this Ben Shapiro view, which, funny enough, is the sort of economics which are coming in here, which is being discussed throughout, is they bring it back down to the individual. And so the ultimate sort of, it's like the ultimate fuck you buddy is the society itself saying, well, tough luck. Like, if you don't fit in, that's too bad. We'll pump you full of pills. But at the end of the day, it's you that's the problem. I mean, if I went along to one of these things, I have no doubt that I would come out as something abnormal when I'm perfectly normal. I might be a bit miserable, but I'm not unhappy. I'm perfectly happy and content with my life, but my general attitude to life is quite downbeat and pessimistic, and that probably wouldn't tick the right boxes. So it's like purely random. I mean, imagine the people in our circles, what kind of answers they could give. Imagine giving a whole load of spiel about Spengler's winter cycle or something like that to one of these psychiatrists. I actually got in touch. It was a troll that I did on my blog, my first blog years ago, where I actually got in touch with some sort of Samaritan thing where they were talking about, if you feel depressed, if you want to get in touch, then do that. And I actually contacted these people with I'll be honest, with the whole point where I was going to make a blog article just to see what they would do, which I did. And I told them that I was depressed about mass immigration. I was depressed about political correctness. I was depressed about how anti-white the society was becoming. The changing demographics and the multiculturalism was making me as a white man anxious, and I was having trouble with it all. And I wanted to know what you would do to help me through this. And they just said that these are political questions, and we're not there to sort of help you out. You're on your own, buddy. And I was like, but like, as a person, I'm perfectly fine. These are societal problems which affect me as an individual. Specific policies which nobody have asked for as well, by the way. But now it's like, well, yeah, sorry, we're not going to be there for you. Well, you're on your own. You're on your own, sunshine. Just deal with it. Eat it up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what Morgoth's given there is a very, very good explanation that relates to stuff that I've referenced on these streams before. It's my customary Mark Fisher moment. This phrase he uses, the privatization of stress, and it's essentially talking about the difference between under the old societies of discipline, where there was hierarchy and you knew what you had to do. In a sense, if you like, stress, the kind of derivative of production in capitalism, was distributed around elites. And in the new system, the so-called societies of control, it's downloaded onto the individual. And it's not just that you're getting more stressed, it's that you are actually earning responsibility for the whole system all at once. And that's what happens in your job today. You're constantly being audited. You're doing logbooks. You're self-monitoring. You're being appraised. You're in continuous professional development. So all of the feedback is all located on you as the node of production in the system. And so the stress, if you like, is all yours. And in the past, if you broke down, well, it doesn't matter, the factory can still function. But now the sense of responsibility that's lumped onto you is of, you are, if you like, the point of catastrophic failure. And this is why Fisher's idea was that it was actually late stage capitalism. I mean, there's a whole range of other things that come in of the general condition of modernity, but that these things, that mental illness as it manifests now is a sort of response to a systemic distortion of how we exist as a society.
Well, one of the things that I really hate about this, by the way, and it actually does relate to Spengler and various other people, Carlyle especially, right? If you think about the great man theory of history, pretty much every great man ever would have been diagnosed with some sort of condition. And like, you can imagine like the young Napoleon would be like, oh, well, you've got narcissistic personality, Napoleon. You've probably got ADHD, and he would have been basically kind of mollycoddled out of the path that he ended up taking, and you wouldn't have got Napoleon. Or you take like any of the, I mean, this is something Dutton has talked about as well. Any of like the great inventors in history, like Isaac Newton or something. Well, like you've clearly got Asperger's, Isaac. So don't worry with it all. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's kind of it feels like a kind of mechanism, a therapeutic state, as Paul Gottfried has talked about it, that actually divests men in particular from achieving their destiny and greatness. And funny enough, this is something that Elon Musk, I think, like I've noticed that like he is getting hit pieces, Morgoth, on his vision of colonizing Mars from like the Daily Mail, which is meant to be a right-wing newspaper, or this rocket that he launched the other day. Like, the press are kind of grudgingly acknowledging that he's done this amazing thing. But it's like Elon Musk, I mean, he's probably got, some sort of, you diagnose him with autism or something, like he's clearly on some sort of spectrum. He's not neurotypical, but he's like, fuck it, I'm going to be the Faustian man here. I'm going to achieve greatness. And you can see the system just hates it. They hate it.
Yeah, it's pathological. It's what was once the driving force of the civilization is now some kind of mental illness, which has been run through the computers and then cranked out the other side, and they've got a ready-made diagnosis. And there's all in terms of that. There's all kinds. I mean, I did a video a few years ago about I've done two major things on him going to Mars, and there was one the other few years ago, which was a video where, in order, like, and I mentioned this in my new article, where in order to justify why he goes to Mars, he has to rely on this kind of Arthur C. Clarke sort of Richard Dawkins line of thinking, where, well, if something bad happens on Earth, an asteroid hits Earth, then it's lights out for the human race. And what does he call it? He's got like a curious phrase where, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket and all of that kind of thing. So behind it, he justifies it all with this sort of utilitarian logic where, well, if we've got colonies on Mars and something bad happens on Earth, the human race will still actually go on. And I'm thinking, I don't believe that for a second. I think you just want to go there for the crack. I think you want to go there because it's there and it has to be conquered. But the way we live in post-modernity, you can't say that because people would think you are mad. People will think you were absolutely crazy if he said, I'm a big fan of Scott of the Antarctic, and I just need to get across that plane. I just have to get it to the pole. I have to get there first, or I have to get up the mountain, just for the simple fact that it's there. And the need to go into that space is just insatiable. It's just like this obsessive drive that I have. I mean, even the word obsessives are sort of this kind of medical language. So he doesn't want to go there. He can't express himself in the terms of a great man. So he has to kind of fall back on this scientific logic and this kind of, well, there's this much chances of a meteor hitting Earth. If we therefore have our biomass on Mars, our overall chances of survival increase by a factor of 2 and blah, blah. I just think all that's nonsense. And it's tragic that he has to justify this spirit through that kind of language.
I mean, look at just, I just want to share my screen a second. Look at how the Daily Mail are framing this. Elon Musk's mission to Mars could ruin the red planet, scientist warns, as the SpaceX CEO reveals plans to set up a city there by 2054. Look at the picture they've chosen of Musk. It's like,
yeah,
I mean, it conjures images of Andrew Ryan or BioShock, or what was that game, Portal? You know, that all of these dystopian fictions of this kind of evil Walt Disney-like character who's got kind of sinister plans. It's a Bond villain. You know, it's kind of like,
yeah.
There's a different way of thinking about this, but in the modern age, even the Daily Mail thinks of it as something, you know, something to generate fear, I guess. But anyway,
just think what he'll do to the atmosphere on Mars.
Asked me a bunch of questions, and if you had these symptoms, which it was like 50 symptoms, and I had probably 49 of them. They said, well, what you experience is common. And actually, when I showed up to these meetings, I seen firemen there and construction workers. It was relieving to see that, you know, I wasn't, you know, making this stuff up.
These new categories of disorder spread quickly in society, and terms like borderline personality disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder took hold of the public imagination. But as this happened, it had unforeseen consequences. Millions of people began to use the checklists to monitor and diagnose themselves. They used them to identify what was aberrant or abnormal in their behaviour and feelings. But by definition, this also set up a powerful model for them of what were the normal behaviour and feelings to which they should aspire. And psychiatrists began to find more and more people coming to them, demanding to be made normal.
It was just a matter of asking people a couple of questions, checking the boxes in the diagnostic formula and say, there you are, you have this disease, or I have this disorder, I better go to my doctor and tell him what I need. And it was an amazing experience and a great change. Most people do not, previously at any rate, want to see themselves as in some way psychiatrically injured. But now they tell me that they have an ideal in their mind about what the normal person is. I don't fit that model. I want you to polish me down so that I fit.
This new system of psychological disorders had been created by an attack on the arrogance and power of the psychiatric elite in the name of freedom. But what was beginning to emerge from this was a new form of control. The disorders and checklists were becoming a powerful and objective guide to what were the correct and appropriate feelings in an age of individualism and emotion. But this was a very different system of order. No longer were people told how to behave by an elite. Instead, they now used the checklists to monitor their feelings and police their own behaviour. They were reassured that these new categories were scientific and could be checked by the power of numbers.
For they are the party of yesterday, and tomorrow is ours.
In 1979, Mrs. Thatcher had come to power in Britain. What she promised to create was a society based on the dream of individual freedom. People would be liberated from the arrogant elites and state bureaucrats of the past. But Mrs. Thatcher knew that she would have to find a new way of managing and controlling these free individuals in a complex society in order to avoid chaos. And to do this, just like the psychiatrists in America, she would turn to systems based on the objective power of numbers. But underlying the new mathematical models would yet again be the dark and suspicious vision of human beings that the Cold War strategists had assumed. This vision would now penetrate to the very heart of the British state. The Thatcher government had begun in the early 80s by selling off many of the state-owned industries. But it soon became clear that in the modern world there were large areas of the state which would have to remain under government control. Yet Mrs. Thatcher was determined to free them too from the old forms of management. To do this, she would bring in a system no longer run by ideas of public duty. Instead, public servants would be encouraged by incentives to follow their self-interest. It was all in keeping with the ideas of the inventor of public choice, James Buchanan. He believed that it was those politicians and bureaucrats who preached the idea of public duty that were the most dangerous, whom he called the zealots. They had to be got rid of.
Pause.
There you go,
So there we go. There we go back to the discussion we had earlier, where actually the people with conviction, you just got to get rid of them.
Isn't it? It's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. You're like, oh, all of society works this way. Oh, you aren't acting in the way that we predicted, therefore you're out. You know, so
yeah. So yeah.
It's safer if we have politicians who are a bit self-interested and greedy, and than if we have these zealots. The greatest danger, of course, is the zealot who thinks that he knows best or she knows best for the rest of us, as opposed to being for sale, so to speak.
So in that sense,
the case for corrupt leadership. I mean, it's kind of interesting.
you can then use incentives. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you just explain that?
Exactly. The zealot is not nearly as readily influenced by monetary incentives or incentives of office or rents as the non-zealot. So you don't want too many zealots in there.
But see, this is so short-sighted because clearly what would happen, or maybe he knows this and is cynically, downplaying it, but we know as students of power, it's always the organized minority, right? So let's say there's one organized minority who has a concentration of capital or money. They could basically game a system, as you were saying earlier on, Morgoth, so that they essentially have a monopoly on those incentives. And I mean, the obvious example is in America, where you've basically got, how many congressmen are there? How many? It's like 60? How many states are there? 100 senators and 600 congressmen or something like that, right? Congressmen and women. Every single one of them, apart from like a handful, are paid off shills. I remember there was a vote in Congress on Israel, right? On are you going to bring in this thing, basically making it like semi-illegal to criticize Israel in America? And I think it was like overwhelmingly they voted it through. There was 21 abstentions, 0 votes against, all for. That was only a few months ago. And it's like, well, essentially what you're doing then is you're opening up the system to be gamed by whoever has the most money and the most organization, because that's what's going to happen.
Something that I find, maybe somebody can correct me on this, because I find this to be so crazy. I'm not sure if I've understood it right, but we've had the Labour Party being in a corruption scandal, and it amounts to, I think the worst thing was somebody's used expenses to pay for their rent. Keir Starmer went to a Taylor Swift concert, and Chip Shop Debs went for a piss up in Ibiza. And there was outrage, just went on and on and on for weeks in the news cycle. And then in America, on Twitter, there's a account called IPAC Tracker, and it'll track precisely every single person in the American government, in Congress, who takes money off IPAC to Shilfar, Israel, and it'll be there. And it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can do like just a Google search and find out like exactly how much Lindsey Graham's being paid, and it's like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you've got these memes now which float around, and it'll be each of these politicians with like a price tag, literally a price tag attached to it of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I thought, this is wild because, yeah, well, we complain about our system all of the time. We do it about how it's all corrupt and we hate them. They don't represent us. All right, fair enough. But I just think like what Angela Rayner gets hauled over the coals for a party in Ibiza, or there's a Taylor Swift concert. In America, it's right out there and blatant and open and public information. And there's no pushback. There's nobody saying, "Hang on a minute, this is corrupt as hell. What the hell is this? Have I missed something there?"
It's so mind-bogglingly, rampant and ridiculous at this moment. I don't know what to say anymore. And then you'll see these same people. They'll go crazy about some other nation being involved. Oh, there should be a complete ban on foreign interference in our system, etc. While they're blatantly and openly on the take from the lobby. So it's just, I don't know. But at this point, I am of the view that on that issue, nothing will wake anybody up. Nothing will at all. I mean, it's just kind of, we're beyond any kind of red line, or it's just so aggressively, nakedly open now, and people are still basically asleep. And when I say people, I mean like half of the chat here, so it's just pointless.
If our success depends on the goodness of the politicians and bureaucrats, then we're in real trouble.
It was a dark and pessimistic vision of human motivation, but it was about to become the basis for a new system of managing the British state.
The proposals represent the most far-reaching reform of the National Health Service in its 40-year history. They offer new opportunities and pose new challenges for everyone concerned with the running of the service.
In 1988, Mrs. Thatcher announced a complete reform of the way the National Health Service was run. The fundamental aim was to overthrow the power of the medical establishment.
I had this in my notes, so I thought it'd be a shame not to say it, but just the way that Margaret Thatcher and Curtis here referred to the National Health Service, and not then it became the NHS, and then it became even more infantilized and became our NHS. And so you can see what is just an institution to serve the public becomes, in the end, it becomes something which is more like a little puppy dog or something. Like it's our NHS, and we give it a cuddle and a kiss, and we take good care of it. When there's a pandemic, our first thoughts are to protect the NHS. It's the family goldfish or something. And it's just, you can go back 40 years and there's not this kind of romanticism about it. It's just a good service that we've got.
Have you noticed, by the way, that since Labour have come in, there's been a kind of slight dialing down of that RNHS worship? And that is because I'm convinced they're going to be carrying out the Blair hatchet on it soon. They're going to do the reforms, the part privatization of large swathes of the NHS is coming. That is coming. But I find it interesting that the entire our NHS kind of mythology really happened under the 14 years of the Tories. Because the NHS is kind of like a mallet to bash Tories over the head with, right? So they then have to show how they're not evil by continually pumping billions into it. Now Labour are in power. I don't know. I mean, obviously we don't have the pandemic at the moment, but I see a lot. Have you seen much our NHS talk of late? Because I haven't. It's because I reckon the public are being primed because they're gonna. Well, to put it frankly, if they don't do it, the economy is going to go. Economically, we cannot sustain it, so they're gonna fucking privatize half of it. I know it.
Yeah, that's already on the way. That's already been dished out. It's like £18 a month for Bupa or something like that. I mean, does that mean the national insurance is going to go down, or is it just a stealth tax? Like, yeah, that's here. That's here coming in right now.
And replace it with a new efficient system of management. To do this, Mrs. Thatcher turned to a man who had been one of the nuclear strategists at the Rand Corporation at the height of the Cold War. He was called Alan Enthoven. Back in the 50s, Enthoven's job had been to think the unthinkable, to plan how to fight and win a nuclear war. To do this, he had designed a mathematical system which would use nuclear weapons as rational incentives to manipulate the other side. Enthoven had designed charts that showed how many megatons of bombs to drop on which cities, and how many people it would be necessary to kill to prove to the Russians that it was in their self-interest to come to the bargaining table. Out of this, Enthoven had developed a technique he called systems analysis. It was a technique of management that he believed could be applied to any type of human organisation. Its aim was to get rid of all the emotional and subjective values that confused and corrupted the system, and replace them by rational, objective methods, mathematically defined targets and incentives. Enthoven had first tried to apply this system back in the 1960s when he was still in the military. The Secretary of Defence, Robert McNamara, asked him to help transform the way the Pentagon was run. Enthoven began by getting rid of the idea that patriotism should be the guiding force in America's defence, and replacing it with a rational system based on numbers.
Brilliant. Nice job, Robert.
The approach we brought to the Pentagon was one based on rational behavior. Previously, that had been, at that high level, it was kind of a political thing, and we were trying to make it more an analytical thing.
Should just mention there's a very good 10-part Vietnam documentary that was released not that long ago, where Robert McNamara is the kind of central villain of the piece. I don't know, I can't remember who did that, but it was on the BBC. I thought it was pretty good, to be honest. And it, went through the tragedy that was Vietnam. I also have a bit of a conspiracy theory on Vietnam, which is that as bad as that war was, that was one war where, let's just say, the new elites were not really up for it. And I have noticed in my long studies that the new elites are very happy to signal against Vietnam, because it was kind of the last hurrah for the old, I guess you'd say, WASP ruling class in America. And they really used Vietnam to cycle out that generation of elites and that way of thinking. And the new lot came in very much after that. So that's something that's I have noticed, I'll just say.
Have you noticed as well, like, what came to my mind when I was watching this about how they wanted to purge patriotism from the and have this kind of analytic, bureaucratic language, is that you actually really see it in Hollywood movies about war, or you can even see it like when the generals talk, or when you can see it on, people like that Scott Ritter, and to a lesser extent McGregor on Judge Knapp, these kinds of characters. And they've got this weird way of talking. If you think of some of the generals like that one that Trump likes from Full Metal Jacket, they do speak in a kind of dry, bureaucratic language. It's all about assets and managing systems and all of this kind of thing, rather than a kind of blood and guts, patriotic fervor and vanquishing evil and all of this. And it's peculiar to the American military. And I think it's interesting to see here that it's being explained that, that was actually a policy brought in. We're going to cut out any kind of, great struggle sort of language, the language of blood and soil and great victories and heroism. And we're going to speak like computers, because they do. They do. It's like where you get these kind of terms like collateral damage, which cover up these horrible realities under bureaucratic jargon. The American military became very good at doing that and covered up a lot of crimes with it.
The people asking for the name of the documentary, by the way, it's simply called The Vietnam War, directed by Ken Burns.
In defense, most people thought it ought to be done on the basis of patriotism. There was quite a bit of that emotion, feeling, are you patriotic, and so forth. And I was there with my slide rule, you know, my geeky sort of MIT style.
Airborne. All the way, sir. Sit down, please. What did the military think of it all?
Well, I think that
They hated it.
they hated it, yeah.
What replaced patriotism and notions of public duty were mathematically measurable outcomes. But McNamara's experiment had ended in disaster when he had tried to run the Vietnam War in a rational, mathematical way, through performance targets and incentives. The most infamous example had been the body count. It had been designed as a rational measure of...
I just want to mention really quickly on McNamara. I've always thought he has the absolute perfect look for his ideology, right? This kind of rational calculation. He's got that slick backed hair, the specs, icy cold look. It's kind of it's fun. It's funny. I've been watching the Hammer horror stuff, and Peter Cushing has got this icy cold British utilitarianism about him in some of those old movies, in The Mummy and Frankenstein and stuff like that. But McNamara is like the American version of that, just icy, like Anglo-pragmatism, I guess you'd call it. But
it's like in America, they have this name for the sort of geeky scientist types. You know, they'll call them the Poindexters. You know, the guys with the kind of buzz cuts and the short sleeve shirts and the pocket protector with the pens in. You know, the sort of people who you see in old pictures working at Rand Corporation. You know, they're kind of the heroic man of science, but he's kind of like the Chad Poindexter at the head of it. You know, the sort of heroic man of science. He's untrammeled by feeling. You know, in pop culture in the 60s, it's kind of personified by the fact that Star Trek kind of makes Spock the other kind of hero, you know, the ultimate rationalist.
Do you think Spock would go for this kind of spreadsheet war? You know, just kind of
he'd be emotionlessly supporting it. Yeah.
Yeah, we have killed 600,000 Vietnamese, so that means we're winning. You know, go on, Morgoth.
Part of the problem, though, is if you strip out all patriotism and nationalism from the language of the military, and then you have it in this kind of pure, as you would say, value-free analytical number crunching, what you've actually done there is just sort of clear the way for somebody else to plant their ideas into this fertile soil. So it's very, very easy to plant politically correct sort of woke language into that void, into that emptiness, to apply a value to it. So you've taken out something which is good and healthy, and then you've left it barren on the assumption that nobody else would come along and plant anything in it, and they came along and did it. This is how you end up with the ridiculous situation of transgender generals and all of this kind of. Then the language is no longer value neutral; it's woke, and that's what's happened to them.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I would agree with that. Yeah.
Whether America was winning.
I talked about Cushing as being a representative of British utilitarianism in those films. If you think about it, the British, that's essentially what happened to the British Empire, is that they took the inherited Christian moral framework and values for granted. And then they thought they could actually do away with that bit and just keep the science part. You know what happened to the British Empire, right? You know what happened to all those values. It's kind of, you can see the American version of this here, I suppose. Because one thing that is clear is that we no longer have this kind of cold, rationalistic, utilitarian government. They're not utilitarian. The current rulers are not in any respect like Robert McNamara, are they? They have, they're ideological, they have values, they, you know, they're often not rational, etc., etc. So,
and you get into a weird situation that when wars come, you have to actually draw on that periodic sentiment, which is traditionally needed for fighting wars and nationalism, to give a narrative, a coherent narrative as to why men should go off and kill people and die for the country. And then it was like there was nothing there. There was just like sort of anti-white stuff, transgender stuff, BLM, and they just kind of turned to ash in their hands. And you can see that now they're trying to find a way to deal with it. I mean, Trump's been pumping out these videos where he's got the drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket, and it's like, we will not have a woke military. And it's as if the ideal to strive for is like the boot camp and Full Metal Jacket, which is, you know, that's just beginning to be sort of, what do they call it? Media literacy. But yeah. All right, whatever. I mean, in a degree, in a way, you know, it's this kind of Kubrickian analysis on how institutions dehumanize people, and then like the boomers have kind of embedded that so that Sergeant Hartman becomes not this demonic, mad sort of character who is there to break people and then rebuild them into psychopaths, but like an all-American hero. He's been absorbed into the greater American boomer narrative and kind of regurgitated as a hero and a patriot, even though, like, you know, as the left are happily pointing out, his original conception is that he is like psychotic. He is a psychotic apparatus of the machine to turn nice boys from Alabama into psychopaths. But yeah, whatever, we'll just go with the vibe and not think about it.
Well, one of the things that really puzzles me at the moment, and this has to be fixed if America really is going to go to war against Iran or any of these kind of, or if we're going to go to war against Russia or whatever, is that at the moment they're trying to run this dual narrative where, you know, I mentioned it when I did that video on Konstantin Kisin, right? It's like, well, on the one hand, you're trying to get Tory boys and, you know, not just Tory boys, the whole population to support literally Nazis in Ukraine, right? Azov Battalion and all of that, or Ukrainian nationalism, okay? Or in the case of Israel, all out, hardcore, religiously infused ethno-nationalism, which is what Israel have at the moment. And if you ever listen to it, the Israelis talk, they're fucking mental. I mean, they're talking about blood libels and ancient prophecies. And it's like, I mean, I'm like, whenever I listen to Netanyahu, I'm like, this guy is, you know, if a Western politician was talking like this, you'd think he was mad, right? So on the one hand, they're trying to get people to support all of that. But at the same time, we've still got a situation where you've got, the likes of Kisin telling us, well, you need to accept Kemi Badenoch as your as the next Tory leader because, frankly, a minority is going to be the only person who's going to be able to sort out this immigration problem. You know, over in America, you still have, you know, it's like, how can you run these two narratives together? At some point, the system, and again, this is where we'll see if there's any rational actors in the system or if they're all fucking crazy. I just don't see how you can run the two such contradictory narratives at the same time.
Yeah, Farage shills for we are the children of the light and we're going to spread across the Middle East and vanquish the evil of Malachi or whatever, but he doesn't shill for the English people exist.
It's just like, but I mean, what I'm saying is, though, if they want people to fight for them, they have to tap into that, whether they like it or not. But it seems like they're not going to do it. It seems like, I mean, if they're ever going to do it, they have to do it now, right? They're gearing up for a war in the Middle East. So I still don't see how they're going to get a situation where you're going to get public buy-in to these wars or, you know, lads signing up for the military in a situation where the system's still basically saying, we hate you. Nationalism for those guys, but you have to accept now that you have to be run by Nigerians, you know. Anyway, let's carry on.
But in fact, troops simply made it up, or even shot civilians to fulfill their performance targets. And in 1967, McNamara had resigned. But Enthoven was undaunted, and next he applied his systems to design a rational way of managing healthcare. He began this in America, but in 1986, Mrs. Thatcher had asked him to come and do the same for the NHS in Britain. Just as he had challenged the power of the generals in the Pentagon, now he would do the same for the doctors in Britain.
I think in both cases, with the military and in the Defense Department and with the doctors both here and in Britain, that you have the power of organized elites, of authority and hierarchy. The system needed to be reconfigured in such a way as to give incentives to do a better job. And it was a matter of how would you rewire the incentives to motivate the self-interest, to create proper incentives to reward efficiency, and can we measure it? So that was a challenge to the power of organized medicine.
What Enthoven proposed for the NHS, he called the internal market. In fact, what it was a mathematical simulation of the...
Is this more Carpenter, Simon?
That's Assault on Precinct 13 again. I'll just say, by the way, I used to work in the NHS in an administrative role where I was a sort of conduit between patients and doctors, and of this culture that's going to be described here is exactly how it is. In fact, I ended up leaving because when you've got somebody crying to you on the phone about something that's really affecting their health and their life, and you're trying to communicate that to a managerial class who are completely incentivized by these performance targets, I would literally be in situations where I'd be saying, I'd be asking for help for something to get done. And they'd be saying, we don't want you to do that. We just want you to meet this target. So it's as stark as that. And I got disciplined twice and then I left because I kept trying to help people.
Renegade, Simon. You
that was the sand
maverick.
in the gears, the fatal mistake.
A madcap maverick, Simon.
Just normal behavior, you would think.
Free market. Numbers were used to create measurable outputs and performance targets at all levels, while competition was created, driven by a system of incentives. All of this mimicked the pressures of the free market on public servants. To those who set out to create it, it was the engineering of a new freedom. They were liberating millions of public employees from the arrogant control of the old elites. Instead, a new and objective method, based on numbers, set the targets which individuals were then free to achieve any way they wanted.
It basically set free their talents. Before, they had simply been instruments doing what they were told. Now, suddenly...
I love how the libertarian is wearing the libertarian bow tie, by the way. He's wearing the lol bow tie, yeah.
They were creative minds allowed to examine and say, why don't we do this? And that sense of freedom that comes in thinking, these were their targets, not something that had been wished on them from on high. And that was a very important part of motivation, for they felt they owned their targets.
But it was a very narrow and specific type of freedom. It meant shedding all ideas of working for the collective or public good, and becoming instead an individual constantly calculating what would be to one's advantage in a system driven and defined by numbers. At the root of this were the simplified, self-interest.
I mean, I thought I would be saving this for a later stream because it'll come back again with a vengeance. But one of the reasons, people will ask how something like, I did a video on this documentary a few years ago, and a lot of the things people will say, how is it that Rotherham could happen? Was it that they were all just brainwashed lefties? And we were talking just before about sort of value free and where the McNamara analytical take, stripping out patriotism and whatnot from the American military. And you can see in the British civil servants and public sector, that's also what's happened. And when we say, well, okay, so they've stripped out any idea of the public good or any idea of patriotism, certainly, or just good old-fashioned Christian morality, what you're left with now is just an individual following incentives and trying to get ahead. And the problem, I mean, this is always the case with libertarianism, is that it gets cooked. So what I mentioned before about how all of a sudden somebody else is going to come in and sprinkle their own slant and ideology into things, and it's going to kind of infect the incentive structure. So if you are aware at some level that a protected group is doing something wrong, as an individual kind of cut off from any kind of higher ideals except your own career, your Christmas bonus and your raise, then you're in a weird situation, because you're actually going to do, you're going to please the system rather than what happens. And so if you look into what happened in the town councils and the child protection services and then the police in places like Rotherham and Telford, it was this. So yes, it's to do with political correctness forming a kind of superstructure, but that interplays with what this whole documentary is about, because all of a sudden the low-level bureaucrat is confronted with a bit of a paradox. They're confronted with something uncomfortable, where they know that a protected group within the system, in the wider culture, they'll not get a bonus for saying this particular group is committing these absolutely atrocious acts, because by virtue of them being a client of power. And so what they're going to do is look for ways to get around that. They're going to look for ways to bury the report or ignore it, and all these things instead of actually dealing with it, because that isn't in their benefit. That is not in their personal benefit to report uncomfortable truths to the higher ups. And even if they did do that, the higher ups are themselves part of this structure, and they are also then going to actually have an incentive to bury the report. And so this was mind-boggling for people when they were thinking, how could this happen? Is it that they are all psychotic leftists? Is it? And I actually blame this system and its implementation for a lot of it.
Creatures that John Nash had created back in the 1950s to make his game theory equations work. But now, the aim of the system of targets and incentives was to transform public servants into just these simplified beings. Individuals who calculated only what was best for them and did not think any longer in wider political terms.
There is this vision of these individual isolated humans, that they are only information processors, there's no emotion involved, that people don't get their some of their motives for participating in politics from, emotional feelings of being part of something larger than themselves. None of that is allowed in this particular theorem. And so what we have is this image of these little information processors who might possibly care about their family or whatever. But I mean, the idea that they have the interests and the welfare of the whole at heart is thought to be naive.
This is the middle of the checkpoint. The gates have been opened. The police are making no attempt to stop people as they go through and come back. I have never seen such elation.
I watched the scenes on television last night and again this morning. You see the joy on people's faces and you see what freedom means to them. It makes you realize that you can't stifle or suppress people's desire for liberty.
What do you think of tonight?
Can I just say that I think this moment of the Berlin Wall coming down is actually at the root of many of our issues at the moment, because it gave the West and America in particular, it kind of flattered them. It flattered America by making it seem like their system had won, whereas in fact the Soviet Union collapsed for all sorts of different reasons. And it kind of gave like a boost to the prestige of the West and the idea that our way works and their way has failed, and therefore we're going to march towards the end of history type thing. Whereas in fact, structurally, America had many of the same many of the same issues and has had many unresolved structural issues going right back to the 60s, 50s even. There's a very good essay on this by Joseph Jordan on his Substack. You can kind of disagree with many of that guy's other takes or his politics or whatever, but I thought he made a very convincing case that this moment here flattered America, flattered the West, and basically meant that we all started to believe our own bullshit, or the system started to believe its own bullshit in a way. So.
Just speaking to that briefly, I'll just nip in. The guy who was talking before the Berlin Wall sequence, he talked about this vision of humans as information processors. We're sort of drifting close to, I've alluded to before, this territory where people like Nick Land are operating, and where our friends Oren McIntyre, Prudentialist, are discussing the impact of his kind of thinking of this idea of machinic desire, repetitive structures, cybernetics, these ideas of circular processes with feedback systems. That's kind of where the future is going. That is the nature of that system changing from these urgent emotional human needs towards these auditable kinds of loops of communication without content, so to speak, just you honoring and driving the system along with inputs and outputs.
Wonderful.
I think the essay I mentioned, by the way, is called "The Collapse of the American Empire." It's like a 3-part series he did back in the spring. Yeah, so you can check that out in your own time.
In November 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed and the Cold War was finally over. A new era of freedom had begun. But the shape that freedom was going to take would be defined by the victors, the West. And as this programme has shown, the idea of freedom that had now become dominant in the West was deeply rooted in the suspicion and paranoia of the Cold War. Next week's film will show how this idea spreads to take over politics itself, because it seemed to offer a new and better alternative to democracy. What it actually leads to is corruption, growing rigidity, and the dramatic rise of inequality. And we will come to believe that we really are the strange, isolated beings that the Cold War scientists had invented to make their models work. This bleak vision, far from liberating us, will become our cage.
Fantastic. I have to say, I think The Trap is stronger than the last one that we watched, Simon.
Yeah.
I think it's the strongest series in general.
Yeah.
Stronger thesis. I mean, Century of the Self is very good as well. But I'm starting to think that Power of Nightmares is a bit of a dip during the peak Curtis years, if that makes any sense.
It was his rank punditry in a way, of the time. I mean, there's much, this is the kind of, if you like, the dark Curtis arc, as we go on, all watched over by machines of loving grace, hypernormalization, the problem of how we live now. And I just want to slip in the last big quote, and this is Rand Corporation, because they're sort of rowing back on this stuff in recent years, and this is from their website. They say, precision and accuracy are different things, of course, and any analytical solution, no matter how clever, is only as good as the model used to derive it. In the excitement that attended Rand's advances, some enthusiasts got carried away and forgot this important truth. In an echo of Jeremy Bentham's philosophic calculus, that's kind of an expression to mean, the maths of happiness, of the 18th century, ambitious social scientists tried to express a host of amorphously defined social benefits and costs with mathematical equations and use them to make, quote, scientific policy decisions on economic, budgetary, and natural resource issues. Robert McNamara, who had been an enthusiast of Rand-style analysis as a high-ranking executive at the Ford Motor Company, tried to run the Vietnam War with models and computers, learning too late that unanticipated factors without a variable in the equation can greatly alter the outcome.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, chaps, let us very quickly do the super chats here. There's just been a couple. Let me just grab them. Lady of Charlotte said, "We were shown Threads at school. Years later, I ended up living in Sheffield, the location. The banal normality of the setting is much of the terror." So, yeah, I mean, would you recommend watching Threads now? I haven't gone back to look at it in recent years.
I certainly would, but I suspect lots of Zoomers would say, "Oh, the special effects are rubbish." "Oh, that's not scary." But again, you're not seeing it in the context of its time when, you didn't have the internet.
I agree with Lady of Charlotte. Like, it's like that kind of where you'll see a Woolworths or an Argos or whatever it was at the time on the high street, which we can all relate to. So this wasn't happening in New York, because there was other movies like that where you'd see nukes go off in the desert of America or across an ocean or an island somewhere, or New York or Los Angeles, but then all of a sudden it's like Sheffield, which we can all relate to, and you think, good God, that's awful. I mean, when you see it now, they've completely abstracted it again. You'll see these videos doing the rounds where it's these computer-generated models of just missiles taking off in a sort of computer simulation, and what we're not seeing is like effects on the ground of people's faces and eyeballs melting out or slowly dying of radiation. And it's like, I've been called a Russia shill before, and I'm like, I'm a not dying in like Fallout shill. I'm a not dying slowly in nuclear winter shill. That's my position.
Yeah.
The NREAB says, "AA, to change the YouTube recommendations on the right side of the video recommendations, there are 3 dots. Left click those and choose not interested." Okay, I'll have to try to remember that. I'll have to try to remember it. If only I'd known, I could have got rid of Blanca Man a lot more quickly. He seems to be gone now. Although he's been gone once before and then he came back again. Inquisition Rack says, "I have recently started to creep up on my wife when she is reading and shouting the deepest law in the intro voice to scare her." You should maybe switch it up a little and maybe shout Adam Curtisisms in her ear. "This was a fantasy," Crispy GT has just sent some money, and then he says, "The next time you need an auto mech, it may be cheaper to fly me to your location, by the way." Well, thanks for that, Crispy GT. He's talking about I think that's a reference to the scholar mechanic I got. That was a while back now, but yes. All right, and I think that is it. They don't usually generate a lot of super chats these Adam Curtis streams, but I still think they are popular and people like them, even though they don't make me any money, so that's good. All right, so where can people find you, Simon Roberts?
I'm on Twitter at Simon__Roberts, and I'd like to recommend the Substacks of the 2 excellent gentlemen here. And lastly, just to annoy AA, as he's complaining about the AA merch store persisting, that's probably because I went last week and bought an AA mug, the classic "Now Get Out" mug, which may have prevented him dissolving the store. But do roll up there and buy as much merch as you can.
What a ridiculous system, though. I'm not dissolving the store because there's new merch, but it won't let you discontinue old merch if there's a single live order, basically. So it's like, all right, okay. So I need to just be really quiet about it for like a month, and when everybody's forgotten about it, discontinue it quietly. That's what I'm gonna have to do. Morgoth, where can people find you, sir?
Morgoth's Review on Substack and on YouTube and on Twitter.
Great, and definitely. If you're not a member of his Substack, those audio things that he puts out are well worth it. It's only like a $5 a month or something, isn't it? So
Yeah, I mean,
Well
it's
worth
just
it.
over a month, yeah.
And I will still encourage people to buy my course at the academic agency. Most importantly, friends, get out, and hopefully by this time next week I'll be well, because this cold has lingered. I'm telling you. I'm gonna go and gargle honey or something.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.